Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I am so glad you are here tonight. Get comfortable if you can, pull the blanket a little closer, let the room settle, and give yourself permission to slow down for a while, because tonight we're going somewhere the old war films almost never take us. Not into the charge across no man's land, not into the general's maps, not into the thunder of artillery above a broken field. We're going underneath it. Down below the duckboards, below the shell holes, below the wet sandbags, below the boots of men who already thought they were living in the worst place on earth. We are going into the narrow, breathless world of the First World War tunnellers, the miners and engineers whose job was to crawl beneath enemy trenches, dig in silence, listen through the earth, and sometimes wait in darkness with enough explosives beside them to lift a piece of the battlefield into the sky. And here is the thing that makes this story so difficult to sit with. These men were not sent underground as a strange side detail of the war. This was not some small experiment performed by a few curious officers with too much imagination and too little sense. By 1915, the Western Front had become a locked door. Armies had charged at it. Artillery had hammered it. Men had died in their tens of thousands trying to open it from above. So someone looked at the mud, the wire, the machine guns, the packed trench lines that stretched from the North Sea towards Switzerland, and reached for a very old answer. If you cannot break through a wall, dig under it. That sounds almost simple when said like that. It sounds practical. It sounds like something from an old siege, something you might read about beneath the walls of a medieval castle. But in Flanders and northern France, in the years between 1914 and 1918, that old idea became something much more intimate and much more frightening. It became a war fought by inches in darkness. It became men lying on their backs in wet clay, pushing with their legs, cutting at the earth with short tools, passing spoil backward in bags, trying not to cough, trying not to breathe too loudly, trying not to let the enemy hear them doing the exact same thing somewhere nearby. Imagine that for a moment. Not the battlefield as we usually picture it, wide and blasted and open to the sky, but a tunnel so cramped that you cannot properly turn around. A candle or a small electric lamp throwing weak light against timber supports. Air that has already passed through too many lungs, mud against your shoulders, water under your knees. The knowledge that somewhere ahead of you, under the same field, German miners may be listening for the scrape of your tool just as you are listening for theirs. If they hear you first, they may set a small explosive charge called a camouflet, not to make a crater for the newspapers, not to announce itself with a great tower of soil and smoke, but simply to collapse your gallery and crush the men inside it. No bugle, no warning, just a dull underground thump, the air punched from your chest, the timbers cracking, the roof coming down, and then the sort of darkness that does not care whether you are brave. Stay with me tonight, because this is one of those parts of history that changes shape the longer you look at it. At first, it seems like a story about engineering, about military tactics, about mines and countermines and explosives packed under enemy lines. And yes, it is that. It is very much that. But underneath all of that, it is a story about men doing a job so unnatural that even the soldiers above them, men living under shell fire, often regarded them with a kind of uneasy respect. Infantrymen feared the sky. Tunnellers feared the earth. The infantryman listened for the whistle of a shell. The tunneller listened for a faint scrape, a tap, a vibration, a sound so small that in any normal life it would mean nothing at all. A spoon against a cup, a boot step in another room, a coal seam shifting in a mine. But beneath no man's land, that faint sound could mean that another human being was digging toward you with the same purpose you had, to get close enough to kill without being seen. Before we go farther, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you in bed with the lights low? Are you sitting on a couch with a drink beside you? Are you somewhere quiet, somewhere noisy, somewhere far away from the mud of France and Belgium, with warm walls around you and a floor beneath you that you trust without thinking? I ask because tonight's story depends on that ordinary trust. the trust that the ground will stay where it is. The trust that the room will not suddenly close around you. The trust that when you lie down in the dark, darkness is only darkness, not a weight pressing from every side. Most of us live our entire lives taking the ground for granted. It holds us up. It stays beneath us. It is the steady thing. For the tunnellers of the First World War, the ground was not steady. It was a workplace, a hiding place, a weapon, a grave, and sometimes all four in the same hour. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you enjoy history told slowly, with attention to the lives of ordinary people caught inside extraordinary events, it would mean a great deal if you subscribed and gave the video a like. You do not have to do it now. Do it when the story pulls you in. Do it when you find yourself picturing the man in the tunnel, wiping clay from his mouth with the back of his hand, waiting for the listener beside him to raise one finger because he has heard something through the wall. And if you feel like leaving a comment, tell me where you're watching from, or tell me what time it is where you are. I always like imagining these stories travelling quietly from one room to another, from one country to another, long after the people inside them have gone silent. Now let us go back, not to the beginning of the war exactly, but to the moment the war became stuck. By the end of 1914, the armies on the Western Front had stopped moving in the way armies were supposed to move. The first months had been fast, confused, violent, full of marches and retreats, and plans that broke apart under real conditions. Then came the trenches. At first, many men thought of them as temporary, a place to shelter for a little while, a line to hold before the next push. But the trenches deepened, sandbags rose, dugouts appeared, barbed wire thickened, machine guns were fixed into position, artillery registered its targets. What had begun as a battlefield became a system, and systems are harder to break than lines on a map. By winter, men were living in ditches that had become addresses. They knew the bad corners, the flooded bays, the places where snipers watched, the communication trenches that sucked boots from tired feet. They knew which stretch of parapet was likely to draw shell fire at dawn. They knew the smell of wet wool, chloride of lime, cold tea, latrines, smoke, and mud churned with things no one wanted to name. Above them, shells came and went. In front of them, no man's land lay torn and wired and watched. Behind the German line there were more trenches, more belts of wire, more guns. Behind the British and French lines the same. Everyone could see the enemy. Almost no one could reach him without being cut to pieces. That was the problem the tunnellers were brought in to solve. They were not all soldiers in the ordinary sense at first. Many were miners, sewer workers, men who had spent their civilian lives underground before the war ever gave the underground a military purpose. Some came from the coalfields of Wales, Yorkshire, Durham, Lancashire, Scotland. Some had worked in clay beneath cities, driving tunnels for sewers and railways. These were men with hands that already knew tools, lungs that knew dust, backs that knew the strange posture of underground labour. They understood timber, pressure, spoil, damp, bad air, and the little warnings that Earth gives before it moves. The army needed that knowledge badly, and it needed it quickly. The British Army before the war had Royal Engineers, and the Royal Engineers could build, bridge, demolish, survey, wire, and solve 100 practical problems that armies create everywhere they go. But the particular underground war that emerged on the Western Front demanded specialists. It demanded men who could dig quietly and accurately under enemy positions while the enemy tried to do the same. In February 1915, British tunnelling companies began to take shape, and by March men were already at work in Flanders. Think about the speed of that. 1 month you might be a civilian miner, used to a pit village and a wage packet and the black familiar world of coal. The next you're in uniform beneath France or Belgium, digging not for fuel, not for a railway, not for wages alone, but toward another army. Your trade has become a weapon. Your old skill, the thing you learned from fathers, brothers, workmates and foremen, has been lifted out of civilian life and lowered into war. There is something unsettling about that. because it reminds us that war does not only take men's bodies, it takes their knowledge. It takes the quiet competence of ordinary work and bends it toward destruction. The tunneler did not need to be taught that the earth could kill him. He already knew that. Miners had always lived with roof falls, gas flooding, and the possibility that a normal shift could turn without warning into a rescue attempt. What changed in the war was that the earth now had an enemy inside it. A collapse might be accident, but it might also be an attack. A sound might be geology, but it might also be a German pick. A pocket of bad air might be natural, but it might also be the result of an explosion designed to suffocate men whose names the enemy would never know. Here is what I want you to really sit with for a moment. The trenches above ground were already terrifying. They were cold, crowded, diseased, and exposed to a level of industrial violence that earlier generations could barely have imagined. But there was still sky above them, even if the sky was grey, even if it was full of shells, even if a man had to crouch below the parapet and watch the clouds through smoke, there was still some part of the world open above his head. The tunneler gave that up. He climbed down a shaft and entered a place where the war became smaller and closer. The front line was no longer a field. It was the wall of earth in front of his face. The enemy was no longer across no man's land. He might be a few feet away, separated only by clay. The battlefield was not measured in yards captured, but in inches dug. A man could spend hours moving forward less than the length of his own body. He could work in silence so complete that the loudest sound in the world was his own breathing. He could stop suddenly because someone behind him had touched his boot, and everyone in the tunnel would freeze while the listener pressed his ear or an instrument against the wall. In that pause, the whole war narrowed to one question. Are they near us? The answer could decide whether the men kept digging, laid a charge, withdrew, or died where they lay. There are jobs in history that seem almost impossible to imagine because they violate something basic in us. Tunnelling under enemy trenches is one of them. We are built to fear confinement. We are built to dislike stale air, unstable ground, darkness, and the knowledge that we cannot run. Soldiers are often described as brave when they go forward under fire, and they were. But there is another kind of courage involved in going downward, into a place where courage has very little room to perform itself. There is no dramatic stride in a tunnel, no banner, no clean heroic pose. Much of the work was done lying down or crouching, filthy, sweating, whispering, hauling bags of soil backward hand to hand so that the spoil could be hidden above ground without alerting the enemy. Even the dirt had to be managed carefully. Too much fresh earth in the wrong place could reveal a mine shaft. The surface war depended on noise, artillery movement, visible destruction. The underground war depended on concealment. The best tunnelling operation was one the enemy did not know existed until the mine exploded beneath him. And that is where the moral weight of this story begins to press in. These men were digging towards sleeping men, waiting men, frightened men, men who were writing letters home and boiling coffee and cleaning rifles and complaining about rations just above the chamber where explosives might eventually be packed. The purpose of the mine was not symbolic. It was to destroy a position and the men holding it. Sometimes a mine would erupt before an attack, tearing open the trench line and shocking the defenders long enough for infantry to rush forward. Sometimes it created a crater that both sides then fought over with a desperation that seems almost absurd, until you remember that the raised lip of a crater could become observation ground, cover, or a new little fortress in the mud. One explosion produced another battle. One underground success created an above-ground wound that men then had to occupy, defend, and die in. The Western Front had a talent for turning solutions into new problems. The tunnellers lived inside that talent every day. They were meant to break the stalemate, but they also became part of it. Mine led to counter-mine. Listening led to counter-listening. A gallery led to another gallery. The war underground spread in places where the trench lines lay close and the soil allowed it. Hill 60, the Bluff, Saint-Éloi, Givenchy, La Boisselle, Messines. Names that appear in military accounts as locations, but for the men beneath them, they were not just names, they were textures of earth, wet or dry, sand or clay, stable or treacherous, deep enough or too shallow. A place where sound carried strangely, a place where water came in faster than pumps could clear it, a place where the enemy seemed always to be just ahead. It is easy, from a distance, to talk about a tunnel as if it were a line on a diagram. Shaft here, gallery there, chamber at the end, explosive charge beneath the enemy position. In reality, it was a living, failing thing. Timber creaked, candles burned down, pumps clogged, men fainted, gas collected, water seeped in through seams, the roof sagged, rats found their way into places where no rat should have had any business being. The men worked in shifts, but the tunnel itself never really slept. Air had to be moved, spoil had to be removed, supports had to be checked, listening posts had to be manned, the enemy had to be detected before he detected you. Above ground, the ordinary soldier might dread going over the top at a set hour. Underground, the hour could come at any time. A man might be killed not because an attack had begun, but because someone in another tunnel, under the same torn field, had heard enough. I find myself thinking about the first time a new tunneler climbed down. Not the trained miner who had known darkness for years, but the soldier attached to the work, the infantryman ordered to carry timber or haul spoil or pump water, in a place that felt less like a trench than a grave with a timetable. He would descend by ladder, leaving behind the cold air and the distant guns, and at first perhaps he would think it quieter down there. That must have seemed almost a relief. The Western Front was rarely quiet above ground. Guns, carts, boots, shouted orders, rifle shots, shells, the endless human noise of armies packed into mud. But then the tunnel quiet would begin to feel different. Not peaceful, close. The sort of quiet that listens back. He would notice how the air changed after a few minutes. He would notice the smell of damp clay and timber and sweat. He would see men working by weak light with the careful movements of people who could not afford panic. Someone would tell him not to speak loudly. Someone would tell him where to put his feet. Someone would tell him that if the order came to stop, he was to stop immediately. Then perhaps the whole line of men would freeze because the listener had raised his hand. In that moment the new man would understand. The silence was not empty. It was full of men trying to survive it. And still they went down. Day after day, night after night they went down because the war required it, because officers planned it, because infantry depended on it, because the men beside them went down too, and because duty in war often becomes most powerful when it has become routine. That is one of the hardest things to understand from the safety of a later century. Not the single dramatic act, but the repetition. The tunneler did not face the earth once. He faced it every shift. He climbed down knowing that other men had been buried alive in galleries like this. He knew rescue might be impossible. He knew that if a tunnel collapsed beyond a certain point, those on the surface might hear tapping for a while and then nothing. He knew that a man underground could disappear from the war without leaving a body to bury. And then he picked up his tools. That is the part that stays with me. Not simply that men were brave, but that bravery became scheduled labour. The job had hours. It had equipment. It had officers, orders, reports, and technical problems. It had the awful normality of any workplace, except the workplace was beneath enemy trenches and might become a tomb before the shift ended. There is a strange human need to make even terrible things manageable by giving them procedures. The tunnelers had methods. They had listening posts, shafts, galleries, charges, tamping, ventilation, timbering, rescue equipment, and rules learned quickly because mistakes underground were not corrected gently. The procedures mattered. They saved lives, but they could not remove the central fact. A man went into the earth, and the earth might keep him. Tonight, we are going to follow that world slowly. We are going to look at how the underground front began, how miners were recruited and organised, how they dug without being heard, how they listened for the enemy, how explosions were prepared, how tunnels collapsed, how men were rescued or not rescued, and how the enormous mines beneath Messines Ridge came to represent both the terrible effectiveness and the terrible cost of this hidden war. But before any of that can make sense, we have to stand for a moment above the ground they entered. We have to see the Western Front not as a line in a textbook, but as a place where ordinary methods of fighting had failed so completely that armies began to search beneath their own feet. We have to look at the mud, the wire, the distance between opposing trenches, the siege conditions that made an ancient form of warfare suddenly modern again. Because no man wakes up one morning and decides that being buried alive under no man's land is a reasonable occupation. Something has to happen first. A battlefield has to become so fixed, so defended, so resistant to every other answer that the only way forward begins to look like down. At ground level, the Western Front looked like a place where everything had already been tried. Men had charged through mud and wire, guns had fired for hours, sometimes for days, until the air shook and the earth itself seemed to lose its shape. Officers had drawn arrows on maps, sent patrols into the dark, ordered raids across shell holes, reinforced parapets, repaired trenches, and watched the same fields become less like fields, and more like a ruined machine for wearing human beings down. By the early months of 1915, the front was no longer a moving battle in the old sense. It was a long fortified scar across Europe, a chain of trenches, support lines, communication trenches, wire belts, strong points, machine gun nests, artillery positions, listening posts, dugouts, dumps, roads, railheads, cemeteries, aid stations, and little battered villages whose names became known to men who had never expected to leave their own towns at home. And between the two armies lay no man's land, which sounds empty until you spend even a few minutes imagining what it really was. It was not a clean strip of ground. It was not simply the space between two enemies. It was a broken zone of shell holes, dead wire, unexploded shells, shattered equipment, bodies that could not always be brought in, scraps of wood, fragments of cloth, duckboards sunk into mud, flare light, machine gun arcs, and the constant knowledge that every yard of it was being watched by someone. In some sectors, no man's land might be hundreds of yards wide. In others, the opposing trenches were close enough that men could hear coughing, singing, hammering, or the scrape of a shovel from the enemy line. There were places where a shouted insult could carry across the gap. There were places where the smell of cooking drifted from one trench to another, and that closeness mattered, because it made the underground war possible. If the enemy was too far away, mining became slow and difficult. If the enemy was close, the earth under no man's land became a second front, a hidden front, a place where the war could continue without a single man climbing over the parapet. The strange thing is that tunnelling did not feel new to the officers who understood military history. Armies had dug under walls for centuries. Long before rifles, barbed wire, or high explosive shells, siege engineers had known that a fortification could be attacked from below. Dig beneath a wall, prop the tunnel with timber, set fire to the supports, collapse the ground, and the wall might fall. Later, with gunpowder, the method became more violent. A mine could be charged and fired, lifting a section of defence into the air. In that sense, the tunnellers of the First World War belonged to an old tradition. But almost nothing about the Western Front made it feel old-fashioned. The men were not digging beneath stone castles. They were digging beneath industrial trench systems held by armies with machine guns, heavy artillery, telephones, searchlights, gas alarms, maps, aerial photographs, and their own tunnellers working from the other side. The old siege method had been pulled into a modern war and made larger, deeper, more technical and more terrifying. A medieval miner might have feared being detected by defenders above him. A First World War tunneller feared being detected by another tunneller under the same piece of ground, a man he would never see, but who might be close enough that both could hear the same water dripping through clay. To understand why men went down there, We have to understand the feeling of being stopped. That was the defining pressure of the Western Front. It was not simply that soldiers were tired or that commanders lacked imagination, though both were often true in their own ways. It was that the material conditions of the front favoured the defender with a force that was brutally difficult to overcome. A machine gun in a protected position could cover open ground. Barbed wire slowed men at exactly the moment speed might have saved them. Artillery could smash trenches, but it could also turn the ground in front of them into a churned obstacle that attackers had to cross while exhausted and exposed. Even when the first trench was taken, a second or third line might wait behind it. Communications broke down. Reinforcements moved slowly, counterattacks came quickly. Men could win a few hundred yards and lose them before the day ended. After enough of that, the earth itself began to look like the only route left. If no one could cross no man's land safely, perhaps men could pass beneath it. If artillery could not reliably destroy a fortified position from above, perhaps explosives placed directly under it could. It was not an elegant thought. It was a desperate practical one. The ground became not just something to stand on, but something to use. The Germans were among the first to make the British feel the seriousness of this underground threat. In late 1914, before the British tunnelling companies had been properly formed, German mining attacks showed what could happen when men worked beneath a front line that thought its danger came mostly from above and ahead. Explosions under trenches did more than kill. They disturbed the mind. A shell came with some warning, at least sometimes. Men might hear it coming. They might know an artillery bombardment was underway. They might crouch, brace, pray, or do nothing at all. But the danger belonged to the sky and the surface. A mine was different. It arrived from below, from the place a man trusted most. One moment the trench was a trench. The next, the floor rose, the parapet vanished. Bodies and sandbags and timber were thrown together, and the position became a crater. There was no familiar direction from which to face the threat. Men could strengthen the parapet, deepen the dugout, thicken the wire, and still the danger might be under their boots. That did something to morale. It made the ground suspect. It turned quiet sectors into places of expectation. If the enemy was mining, then every faint vibration could be a warning. Every unexplained sound in the trench wall could start rumours. Men lying in dugouts could wonder whether they were resting above a charge already laid and waiting. The hidden front developed from that fear as much as from strategy. It was offensive, yes. Mines could be used to blow a gap under the enemy line before an infantry assault. But it was also defensive. If the enemy was tunnelling toward you, you had to tunnel toward him, or around him, or beneath him. You had to listen. You had to intercept. You had to fire smaller charges to crush his gallery before he reached your trench. This is why the Underground War became a contest of detection. The men did not simply dig forward as if building a passage. They searched for the enemy through the earth. Listening posts were driven out from main galleries. Men sat or lay in them for long hours with their ears pressed to the ground, to a timber, to a metal rod, or to instruments designed to pick up vibration. The work required patience of a kind most soldiers were never trained for. Above ground, war was often noise beyond endurance. Underground, survival could depend on noticing the smallest sound and understanding what kind of sound it was. A pick made one note, a shovel another. Clay being cut by a special tool had its own faint signature. Water moving through a seam could deceive the listener. Rats could deceive him. Timber settling could deceive him. His own pulse might seem too loud. Men had to learn to separate the living sounds of the earth from the human sounds inside it. There is something almost unbearable about that image if you stay with it for more than a moment. A man underground, holding himself still, not because he is resting, but because movement would interfere with listening. The tunnel behind him is full of men who would rather be moving because movement feels like control. The lamp is low, the air is poor, somewhere above perhaps artillery is firing, but down here that noise arrives muffled, distant, not gone, but changed. The listener is waiting for a scrape. He knows the enemy may be doing the same thing in the opposite direction. He knows that if he hears them, they may already be close. He also knows that if they hear him first, the next sound may be the last one he ever understands. This kind of war did not reward impatience. It rewarded stillness, nerve, skill, and a willingness to occupy fear without making it worse for the men beside you. Panic underground was dangerous. A man who bolted could block a gallery. A man who shouted could give away a position. A man who dropped a tool at the wrong time could sound, to the enemy, like proof that someone was near. Discipline in a tunnel was not about parade ground sharpness. It was about not letting your body do what it naturally wanted to do. The geography of the Western Front shaped everything. The soil was not the same from one sector to another. In some places, chalk allowed deeper, more stable workings. In others, clay held shape well enough for the technique known as clay kicking, where a man lay back on an inclined board or wooden support and used his feet to push a sharp, spade-like tool into the face of the tunnel. This was quieter than pickwork and could be surprisingly efficient in the right ground. The loosened clay was then removed by hand, placed into bags and passed backward along the gallery. In wet or sandy places, everything became harder. Water could flood a working. Sand could run. Timbering had to be more careful. Pumps might be needed constantly. A frontline trench might be miserable above ground because of mud and shell fire, while below it the tunnellers faced an entirely different set of problems created by geology, depth, drainage, pressure, and the need for secrecy. Every sector had its own underground personality. Men learned the ground under their battlefield as intimately as sailors learn a coastline. They knew where it held and where it betrayed them. The spoil was a problem people rarely think about. Digging produces earth, and earth has to go somewhere. A tunnel under no man's land could not simply announce itself by leaving a fresh mound behind the front line. The enemy observed everything he could, from trenches, observation balloons, and aircraft. Fresh soil in the wrong place might invite shell fire or reveal the start of a mine. So spoil had to be hidden, spread, carried away, mixed with existing earth, dumped discreetly, sometimes even used to reinforce positions in ways that did not appear suspicious. This turned every bag of clay into a secret. Imagine the labour of that. The man at the face cuts, another gathers, another fills. Others pass the bags back through the cramped passage. At the shaft, more men lift or carry it away. None of this is glamorous. None of it looks like the war posters, but without it, the tunnel cannot move. The enemy does not need to see the whole operation, he only needs to notice enough. Air was another enemy, and not a dramatic one at first. Bad air does not always arrive with a clear announcement. It thickens, it dulls the head. Lamps burn poorly. Men become tired in a way that is not ordinary tiredness. In deep or poorly ventilated workings, oxygen could fall and dangerous gases could collect. Explosions made this worse. A fired mine or camouflage could fill a gallery with fumes, dust, and carbon monoxide. Men sent to rescue others might become victims themselves if they entered too quickly or without proper precautions. The underground front demanded practical engineering at every step. Shafts needed ladders, galleries needed timber, air had to be moved, water had to be managed, charges had to be carried and placed, cables had to be protected, listening stations had to be maintained. Maps had to be accurate enough that men underground could find a point under an enemy position without ever seeing it. A mistaken direction could mean missing the target. A mistaken depth could mean being heard. A mistaken judgment could mean meeting the enemy before you were ready. That word, meeting, sounds too polite for what could happen underground. Sometimes opposing galleries intercepted one another. Sometimes men broke through into enemy workings or came close enough to fight in conditions that barely seemed possible. There are accounts of grenades, pistols, knives, and hand-to-hand struggle in tunnels, But much of the underground war was not fought face to face. It was fought through charges placed to destroy men without seeing them. A camouflet was a small mine intended to collapse an enemy tunnel without necessarily breaking the surface. It was a weapon of suffocation, crushing, and burial. To the men above it might be felt as a tremor, heard as a dull report. To the men in the gallery, it was the roof coming in, the lamp going out, the air filling with dust, the timber giving way, bodies thrown against clay and wood. If the collapse was close to the shaft, perhaps rescue could begin. If it was far forward, beyond broken ground, the calculation became cruel very quickly. How much air remained? Could another gallery reach them? Could anyone hear tapping? Was the enemy still nearby? Would another charge be fired? In mining accidents at home, rescue could also be desperate and difficult, but in war the rescuers were often working under enemy observation and shell fire, with the added fear that the underground position had not finished killing. For the infantry in the trenches above, the hidden front created a steady nervous pressure. Men might be ordered to stay in a position that was known or suspected to be mined. Rumours travelled quickly in trench life. A new crack in the parapet, a muffled sound, a report from tunnellers, a sudden order to evacuate a bay or reinforce a crater, all could feed the imagination. Soldiers already lived with many kinds of fear, but mine fear was distinct because it made waiting feel active. The danger did not need weather, visibility, or an attack order that the infantry could see forming. It could be progressing slowly beneath them while they smoked, wrote letters, cleaned equipment, or tried to sleep. Some men became deeply uneasy in dugouts for this reason. A dugout might protect against shell fire, but if the mine came from below, being underground might feel less like safety and more like being halfway buried already. It is difficult to measure that sort of fear in official records. Reports can tell us about mines fired, galleries driven, casualties suffered, craters created. They cannot fully show what it meant for thousands of men to live on ground that might suddenly rise beneath them. The hidden front also changed the landscape above it. When a mine exploded, it did not simply remove part of a trench, it made a new feature. A crater could be deep, wide, and violently unstable, with steep sides and loose earth. Its rim might offer observation over nearby ground. For that reason, both sides often rushed to occupy craters after an explosion. Think about the grim logic of that. Men dug underground to destroy a position. The mine created a crater, and then men had to fight in and around the crater, turning the result of the explosion into yet another contested piece of the front. A crater could fill with water, bodies, debris, and gas. It could be shelled repeatedly. It could become a place where patrols met at night, where grenades were thrown from lip to lip, where wounded men slid down slopes of mud and could not climb out. The underground war did not stay underground. It burst through the surface and made new wounds that the surface war then claimed. In places like La Boisselle on the Somme, the land became a layered battlefield. Above ground, trenches and shell holes. Below ground, old galleries, new galleries, collapsed workings, chambers, charges, listening posts, and the remains of men whose exact position might never be known. Some areas were mined and countermined so heavily that the underground map became almost as important as the trench map. Yet even maps could lie by omission, damage, or uncertainty. Earth moves. Timbers collapse. Explosions distort distances. A gallery recorded as safe might later become dangerous. A charge might fail to detonate and remain under the battlefield. A tunnel might be forgotten until later work or later generations found its traces. This is one of the reasons the story of the tunnellers does not end neatly with the war. The surface healed unevenly. Grass returned. Villages were rebuilt. Roads crossed old battlefields. But beneath them, in some places, the hidden front remained, not as a metaphor, but as timber, chalk, clay, metal, explosive, and bone. What I find important to remember is that the men who created this world were not anonymous machines of war. They were often older than the average infantryman, or at least more specialised. Many came from communities where mining was not just a job but a family inheritance. A coalfield had its own culture, its own dangers, its own pride, and the army drew on that. A man who had spent years underground at home brought more than technical ability. He brought a way of reading danger that could not be improvised. He knew when timber sounded wrong. He knew what bad air felt like before someone with less experience understood it. He knew how men behaved when confined, tired, frightened, and responsible for one another. In civilian life, those skills helped bring coal to the surface, drive tunnels, build infrastructure, earn wages. In France and Belgium, the same knowledge helped plant explosives under men who were likely very much like him, only born on the other side of the war. That is not a sentimental point, it is a historical one. Modern war has always been able to take civilian expertise and redirect it. Chemists, railwaymen, engineers, doctors, miners, mechanics, clerks, farmers, all found that what they knew could be made useful to armies. The tunneler's tragedy was that his useful knowledge belonged to darkness. A shift underground did not necessarily look dramatic from the surface. A man might leave a trench, disappear down a shaft, and be gone for hours. The entrance might be screened and protected. Supplies moved quietly. Timber went down. Bags came up. The war above continued with its ordinary misery, and beneath it another working day unfolded. At the face, men could not all work at once. Space decided the number. One man cut, another cleared, others hauled. Behind them, men maintained the tunnel, brought forward materials, checked air, listened, measured, and waited. The narrowness mattered. A trench could be crowded, but men could still step aside, duck, climb, run, or fall. In a tunnel, the body had fewer choices. If the man in front stopped, the men behind him stopped. If the tunnel collapsed, men behind might survive, while men ahead vanished from reach. If smoke or gas entered, withdrawal could become slow and confused. Everything depended on order, and order depended on men who were exhausted enough to make mistakes but trained enough not to. And then there was the psychological division between above and below. Soldiers above ground sometimes treated tunnellers with a mixture of admiration and suspicion. They knew the tunnellers did something necessary. They also knew that tunnellers brought news no one wanted. If a tunneller said the enemy was close, a trench that had felt merely miserable could become unbearable. If he said a mine was suspected, men might be ordered out or told to remain, depending on the tactical situation. The tunnellers themselves moved between worlds. They might come up from a gallery into a trench where men complained about rations or rain. And for a moment the ordinary discomforts of trench life must have seemed both familiar and strangely open. There was air. There was sky. There was room to stand. Then the shelling would begin, and the surface would remind them that it had its own ways of killing. No part of the front was safe. The tunneller did not escape the war above by going below. He added another war to it. The hidden front under no man's land was therefore not a separate story from the trenches. It was the trenches extended downward. It was the same stalemate translated into earth and timber. It had its own tools, sounds, risks, and forms of courage, but it existed because the surface had become so hard to cross. When we imagine the First World War, we often picture men going over the top, and rightly so, because that image captures a terrible truth about the conflict. But at the same time, under their boots, other men were going forward in the opposite posture, not upright into machine gun fire, but bent, crouched, or lying down, moving into darkness with a bag of spoil at their feet, and the enemy somewhere beyond the next few feet of clay. One war was visible enough to be photographed. The other was often known only afterward, when the ground erupted, when a crater appeared, when a rescue party went down, or when a report stated in calm language that a gallery had been lost. To follow these men properly, We have to leave the wider view now and get closer to the work itself. Not the idea of tunnelling, not the map symbol, not the neat military phrase, but the physical routine of a shift below the front. The climb down the shaft, the smell in the gallery, the awkward passing of tools, the method of cutting clay without too much noise, the timber set in place to hold back the weight above, the slow removal of spoil. The way a man learned to make his body smaller than it wanted to be, the way time behaved underground, where minutes could stretch around a sound and hours could disappear into labour. Because the hidden front was not built by strategy alone. It was built by hands, knees, shoulders, lamps, boards, shovels, pumps, and men who understood that every inch forward might bring them closer to the enemy, closer to the charge, or closer to the place where the tunnel became a grave. The first surprise about the tunnellers is how little of their work looked like fighting. If you walked past the entrance to one of their shafts from the trench above, you might not see anything dramatic at all. No men forming up for a charge, no bayonets fixed, no officer with a whistle waiting for the appointed minute. You might see timber stacked under cover, sandbags moving in a careful line, a cable disappearing somewhere it did not seem to belong, a few Royal Engineers with the tired, clay-streaked look of men who had been working in a place where uniforms stopped being uniforms and became another layer of dirt. The actual violence was still ahead of them, or beside them, or underneath them, but the work itself began with ordinary motions. A man climbed down a ladder, another passed a tool, someone checked a lamp, someone adjusted a plank, someone whispered for silence. Then the tunnel took them in, and once it did, the war above became a muffled thing, still present, still dangerous, but no longer the main world. The main world was now the face of the gallery, the narrow working end where the earth waited to be cut away one small piece at a time. This is what made the job so strange. The tunneler was moving toward death by doing something that looked patient, repetitive, and almost domestic in its smallness. Cut, scoop, bag, pass back, brace, listen, cut again. There was no clean division between labour and terror. They were the same activity. In some parts of the front, especially where the clay allowed it, the British used a method that had come not from battlefields but from civilian engineering work beneath cities. It was called clay kicking, though men also knew it as working on the cross. It had been used in England for sewer tunnels, road tunnels and railway work, especially in the heavy clays under places like London and Manchester. The army did not invent it. War rarely invents as much as it borrows, adapts, and hardens. Civilian clay kickers had already learned how to drive a tunnel quietly and efficiently, through firm clay with very little space. That mattered on the Western Front because noise could be fatal. A pick striking earth, a shovel scraping too hard, a careless hammer blow on timber, all of it could travel in ways men did not always expect. Underground, sound was not just sound. It was evidence. It could tell the enemy that you were there, how close you were, and perhaps what you were doing. Clay kicking gave the British a way to move through certain ground with less noise than pick and shovel work. It was not easy. It was not comfortable. But it was quiet. And quiet was as valuable underground as armour was above. Picture the man at the face. He's not standing with a full swing of the arms because there is no room for that. He's lying back on an angled wooden support, often with his body braced in a position that would make sense to a sewer worker and feel impossible to almost anyone else. His feet hold the digging tool, a short spade-like implement with a rounded or cupped blade. He pushes it into the clay using the strength of his legs, twists and cuts, then brings away a slice of earth. His hands help guide the motion, but the real power comes from the lower body, from the hips and thighs and knees of a man who may do this again and again for hours. The clay comes away not in heroic chunks, not in the satisfying fall of a shovel in a garden, but in controlled pieces. The space is too small for wasteful movement. Behind him is the bagger, who gathers the clay and stuffs it into sandbags. Behind the bagger, another man moves the spoil back, sometimes to a small trolley, sometimes hand to hand, sometimes through a cramped chain of men where each person's job is simple and essential. The trammer, when there was rail enough for a trolley, moved the load back toward the shaft and returned with timber or supplies. The words make it sound organised and clean. Kicker, bagger, trammer, 3 roles in a small working team. But the reality was sweat, bad air, cramped muscles, clay on the skin, clay on the lamp, clay in the cuffs. Clay worked into the seams of clothing until a man seemed less dressed than coated. The tunnel advanced slowly, and yet in the right ground it could advance faster than a person might expect. A skilled clay-kicking team could make progress that surprised ordinary soldiers who imagined digging only as men with picks and shovels. But speed was never the only concern. Direction mattered. Depth mattered. The shape of the gallery mattered. The tunnel had to go where the plan required it to go, and it had to do so without betraying itself to the enemy. Surveyors and officers above might mark positions on maps, but underground the work depended on disciplined measurement. A small error repeated over distance could put a gallery too far to one side. A mine chamber dug under the wrong spot might waste weeks of effort. A tunnel too shallow might be heard more easily or damaged by shell fire. One too deep might take too long, flood, or miss the tactical purpose entirely. Men often worked beneath ground that had already been shattered above. Shell holes changed drainage. Old trenches disturbed the soil. Buried wire, timber, equipment, and bodies complicated the work in ways no neat plan could fully show. The tunnellers were not moving through empty earth. They were moving through a battlefield that had been driven downward by months of destruction. Every few feet the tunnel had to be supported. The earth did not simply agree to remain in place because men had a military objective. Timber sets were brought down and installed to hold the roof and sides. In firmer clay, less timber might be needed than in unstable ground, but no man who had worked underground took the roof for granted. Wood creaked, pressure shifted, clay squeezed. Water softened things that had seemed safe the day before. A tunnel could close slowly, almost thoughtfully, before it failed. Men who knew mines understood these little warnings, and that knowledge saved lives, though never all of them. The supports were not decorative. They were the thin agreement between the men and the weight of the battlefield above. Above that roof were trenches, sandbags, guns, duckboards, men walking, shells landing, rain soaking down, and in some places the bodies of previous fighting. Below it were the tunnellers, their lamps, their tools, and a passage barely large enough to serve as a road toward destruction. When timbering was done badly or too late, the tunnel could punish the mistake without ceremony. The air in the gallery was part of the work from the beginning. A person who has never spent time underground might imagine that air is simply there until it is not. The tunnellers knew better. Air had to be brought in, moved, protected, and watched. A short working might remain tolerable for a time, but as galleries lengthened, the face could become heavy and stale. Men exhaled into the small passage. Lamps consumed oxygen. Damp and heat collected. The smell became a mixture of clay, sweat, timber, candle grease, or oil, explosive stores in some places, and the sour odour of bodies doing hard labour without enough clean air. Ventilation pipes or tubes could push fresher air toward the working face, but pipes could be damaged, blocked, or insufficient. Fans and bellows had their place. So did experience. Men watched flames. They watched one another. A man becoming dull or clumsy might be exhausted, or he might be suffering from bad air. After explosions, especially camouflages and mine blasts, the air could become deadly with fumes and carbon monoxide. Rescue work then became its own danger. A man trying to save friends could take only a few breaths in the wrong place and become another body to carry out, if he could be reached at all. Water made everything slower. It came through seams, seeped down from ruined ground, collected in low points, and turned a working floor into a sucking misery. Pumps could keep a gallery alive. But pumps required men, maintenance, and power of some kind, even if that power was only human effort repeated until shoulders ached. In wet sectors, boots never dried. Clothes stayed cold, skin softened and broke. The tunnel face could become a place where every movement made mud, and every bag of spoil felt heavier than it should. Water also changed sound. It carried, swallowed, distorted, and lied. A drip could seem like tapping. A shifting pocket could sound like movement. A man listening through wet ground needed judgment, not just good ears. The work was technical in all these small ways. Not technical in the sense of clean instruments on a table, but technical in the practical knowledge of men forced to solve problems in a space where there was no room to stand upright and no margin for pride. The tools had to be handled with a discipline that would have seemed excessive anywhere else. Above ground, the war could be wasteful beyond imagination. Whole landscapes were blown apart. Artillery used shells by the thousands. Trenches were rebuilt after being destroyed, and destroyed after being rebuilt. Underground, a dropped tool mattered. A shovel scraping too loudly mattered. A whispered order might travel farther than expected. Men padded things, wrapped things, passed things carefully, and learned to move as if the earth itself might report them. Silence was not natural during heavy labour. Human beings grunt, cough, swear, shift their weight, clear their throats, and knock knees against boards when they are tired. Tunnellers had to fight those habits. They also had to keep working. The contradiction is worth noticing. They were doing hard physical labour while trying to behave as if nothing was happening. It was like asking a man to move a wall while pretending to sleep. The spoil bags are one of those details that make the whole underground war feel real. Every inch of forward movement had a physical cost that had to be removed from the tunnel. Earth did not vanish. It had to be gathered, bagged, dragged, lifted, hidden, or used. A working face produced bag after bag after bag. Each one moved backward through the cramped gallery, sometimes along a small track, sometimes in the hands of men who could not straighten their backs. At the shaft, the spoil came up into the trench system and had to disappear into the surface wall without drawing attention. Some could be packed into sandbags and used for protection. Some could be spread among existing spoil. Some had to be carried away under cover. The enemy watched for signs. Fresh clay of a particular colour could betray digging. A new mound could invite shelling. Even the waste of the tunnel had to be disguised. So the tunnellers fought not only with explosives and tools, but with housekeeping. They had to keep a secret tidy. This is the part of the work that most modern people underestimate. The mine was not just the chamber at the end with explosives inside it. The mine was the whole system of labour required to make that chamber possible. The shaft had to be sunk. The gallery had to be driven. Timber had to be brought in. Spoil had to be removed. Air had to be forced forward. Water had to be pumped. Men had to be fed, relieved, organised, and kept from collapsing from exhaustion. Measurements had to be checked. Listening had to continue. The enemy's movements had to be estimated. Explosives had to be carried safely when the time came, sometimes in great quantities, and then tamped properly so the force of the blast went where it was meant to go. Each stage had its dangers. A man might survive weeks at the face and be killed by a collapse behind him. He might work on a gallery that was later abandoned because the enemy had driven too close. He might spend days hauling spoil for a mine he would never see fired. War often reduces men to outcomes in the record, but the tunneller's life was full of unfinished labour, false starts, blocked galleries, flooded workings, and the endless work of keeping something fragile usable. There were moments when the men underground could hear the war above very clearly. A heavy shell landing nearby might shake dust from the roof or make timber jump. The tunnel might tremble, and every man would pause because shellfire above and instability below made a bad partnership. A shell could break a shaft entrance, damage ventilation, or collapse shallow workings. Men below had to trust that the surface crew would keep the entrance usable, because the shaft was not merely an access point. It was the way back to air, light, and whatever counted as safety. To be trapped beyond a damaged section was one of the central nightmares of the job. Men in ordinary trenches feared being buried by shell fire too. Dugouts collapsed under bombardment. Saps and shelters filled with earth. But a tunneler was already enclosed when the collapse came. He had already given up the open route of escape. His survival might depend on a few feet of timber, the strength of men digging toward him, and how much air remained in the pocket where he lay. The closeness of the work created a particular kind of dependence among the men. A tunnel face could not function if each man thought only of himself. The kicker needed the bagger to clear the clay. The bagger needed the spoil moved back. The men moving spoil needed the trammer or carrying chain to keep the passage open. The timbermen needed space at the right time. The listener needed everyone to become still when he signalled. The officer or NCO needed accurate information from men who knew the ground better than any map. In that space, rank mattered, but competence mattered too. A civilian miner in uniform might have a practical authority that no parade ground soldier could fake. He knew what a roof sounded like before it went. He knew how to judge clay. He knew how exhaustion made men careless. He knew that fear, like water, found any opening. This was not a war for loud confidence. Underground, a boastful man could become a danger very quickly. The tunnel respected skill more than speeches. Still, the men were soldiers, and the military purpose was never absent. The gallery moved toward an enemy position. That fact sat inside every shift, even when the immediate work was nothing more than cutting clay and hauling bags. A tunneler could focus on the next task because men have always survived frightening work by narrowing their attention. Set the timber, fill the bag, watch the flame. Do not kick too hard. Keep the line moving. But beyond the task was the direction. Forward. Always forward, unless ordered otherwise. Forward meant nearer to the German line, nearer to the place where a charge might be laid, nearer to the place where the enemy might already be waiting. The men were not digging a refuge, they were digging an approach. That difference mattered. A dugout was meant to shelter, a mine gallery was meant to arrive. Sometimes the work had to slow so listening could take over. A listener might be placed in a small chamber, or at the end of a branch gallery, away from the immediate noise of digging. Men used simple methods and, as the war developed, more specialised listening equipment, but much still depended on patience and interpretation. The listener might ask for all work to stop. Tools lowered. Men held themselves still. Even breathing seemed too loud. Then came the strange waiting. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps a faint scrape. Perhaps a tap repeated at intervals. The question was not only whether the enemy was there, but where, how far, and doing what. Was he digging? Was he timbering? Was he placing a charge? Was he listening too? Underground, men could be close enough to kill one another without any clear sense of distance. The wall of earth between them might feel thick until it was not. A few feet could be safety, warning, or doom. There is an awful intimacy in this kind of enemy contact. Above ground, soldiers might see distant figures, helmets, flashes of movement, smoke from rifles, silhouettes in flare light. Underground, the enemy often existed first as sound. Not a face, not a uniform, a rhythm, a disturbance. Another man's work entering your world through clay. You could hate that sound, fear it, study it, and still know, if you had any imagination left, that the man making it was probably in much the same position as you. He too was sweating. He too was trying not to be heard. He too had men behind him depending on his hands. He too wanted to go home. The war did not become kinder because of that knowledge. If anything, it became more terrible, because the tunneler's job was to turn that hidden nearness into an advantage before the other side did. The body paid for this work in ways that did not always appear in casualty lists. Knees, backs, shoulders, wrists and lungs suffered. Men worked in cramped postures for long periods, often in wet clothing and poor air. Their skin was rubbed raw. Their hands cracked. They emerged from shifts looking older than when they'd gone down. Sleep above ground was interrupted by shelling, orders, and the general discomfort of trench life. Sleep below ground, when it happened in rest areas or dugouts, carried its own unease. A tunneler could close his eyes and still feel the pressure of the tunnel around him. Men who had worked in civilian mines were used to underground labour, but the front added shell fire, enemy countermining explosives, and the knowledge that the workplace itself was a target. A coal miner at home feared accident. A tunneler feared accident and intention together. The enemy was not waiting passively for the Earth to fail. He was trying to make it fail in exactly the place where you were. Food and drink became part of the routine, as they always do in hard labour. Tea, when available, mattered more than a comfortable person might understand. A cigarette at the shaft mouth, a swallow from a bottle, a tin mug passed from hand to hand, these were not sentimental details. They were small ways men returned to themselves between hours underground. The contrast must have been sharp. A man could come up from a gallery where every sound had been controlled, every movement cramped, every breath shared, and find himself in a trench still miserable by any normal standard, but with sky above it. Even a grey sky over Flanders might feel wide after a tunnel. He might stretch his back, wipe his hands, drink tea, hear artillery, and then be told when his next shift began. The war allowed little time for the body to understand what it had endured. As the gallery approached its objective, the emotional pressure changed. Early work might feel like construction, however dangerous. Later work felt like approach. The enemy line was closer. Listening became more important. The risk of being detected increased. The mine chamber had to be formed, sometimes widened carefully at the end of a long gallery, and then the explosives had to be brought in. Carrying explosives underground was a different kind of quiet work. Men moved heavy materials through narrow passages, knowing exactly what those materials were meant to do. The charge might consist of ammonal or other high explosives packed into the chamber. Then came tamping, the packing of the gallery with earth or bags, so that when the mine fired, the force would travel toward the enemy position, instead of simply blowing back down the tunnel. The preparation was technical, physical, and grim. A man could spend days helping create the conditions for a blast that, when described later, might take only one sentence in an official account. Before the firing, men withdrew. Cables were laid, final checks were made, infantry above might be warned, moved, or prepared for an attack. The tunnellers who had dug the mine might not be the men who pressed the switch or fired the charge, but they knew what was coming. This is where the slow work turned suddenly into violence. Weeks or months of hidden labour became a few seconds of force. The ground that had been cut in secret announced itself with a roar. A trench disappeared. A crater opened. Men above were killed, stunned, buried, or thrown. The earth rose and fell. Then the surface war rushed in again, because infantry might be ordered forward to seize the crater or exploit the damage. For the tunnellers, the explosion was not always a conclusion. There might be assessment, repair, countermining, rescue, or the beginning of another gallery. The war consumed even its successful moments. But not every tunnel reached that point. Some were lost before they fulfilled their purpose. Some were crushed by enemy camouflages. Some flooded. Some became too dangerous to continue. Some had to be abandoned because German miners were closer than expected. An abandoned tunnel was not necessarily empty in the mind of the men who had worked it. It held labour. It held hours of fear. It held the shape of bodies that had moved through it. If men had died there, it held them too. The phrase buried alive appears in histories of tunnelling because it is unavoidable, but it can become too easy to pass over. Buried alive was not a dramatic phrase invented for effect. It described a real possibility of the job. A collapse could trap men beyond reach. They might have air for a while. They might tap on pipes or timber. Men outside might hear and dig. Sometimes rescue succeeded. Sometimes the sounds stopped. The tunnel then became both workplace and grave, and the war moved on because armies move on even when human beings cannot. What makes the quiet work of tunnelling so hard to hold in the mind is that it joined patience with horror. Many forms of battlefield danger were sudden, but tunnelling often approached danger by routine. The men knew the risks in advance, and still the work demanded concentration on ordinary details. A poorly tied bag could spill. A badly placed timber could shift. A noisy cut could betray the gallery. A careless candle could be dangerous. A wrong measurement could waste the mine. The small tasks did not become small because the stakes were large. They became more important. That is one of the truths of this underground war. Men did not survive by thinking constantly about death. They survived, when they did survive, by doing the next necessary thing correctly in a place where mistakes had very little distance to travel before becoming fatal. Late in a shift, fatigue changed the tunnel. The lamp seemed weaker. The air seemed warmer. The body wanted to straighten and could not. The knees complained. The back tightened. The hands moved more slowly. Men became irritable in whispers. Someone shifted a bag awkwardly. Someone took too long moving back. Someone coughed and was cursed under the breath, not because coughing was immoral, but because fear needed somewhere to go. Then the order might come to stop, and the whole gallery would settle into listening. The exhausted men would hold themselves still again while the listener tried to read the earth. In that silence, each man could hear small things from his own body: blood in the ears, breath through the nose, a boot creaking, clay sliding softly somewhere unseen. Perhaps the enemy, perhaps nothing. The difference mattered more than anything else in the world. When the shift ended, the men did not return to comfort. They returned to the trenches. That fact should not be forgotten. Above ground there was mud, shellfire, rats, cold, lice, orders, fatigue, and the long waiting of ordinary trench warfare. The tunneler's rest was still inside the larger war. He might sleep in a dugout not far above the very system of galleries where others were working. He might wake to bombardment. He might be called back because listening had detected the enemy. He might be sent to help after a collapse. He might hear that another company had lost men underground and know exactly what that meant in the body, not as a headline, but as a set of sensations. The dust, the dark, the blocked passage, the desperate digging, the hope of hearing a tap. And then he would go down again. The work continued because it had to. That is the plainest and hardest sentence in any war. Men went down because a position had to be mined, because an enemy gallery had to be found, because infantry above needed protection, because the front demanded pressure, because the army had made underground work part of its system. They went down with miners' knowledge, soldiers' discipline, and human fear. They made roads no one was meant to walk openly. They built chambers meant to disappear. They learned the personality of clay and chalk under places whose names became part of military history. And every time the digging stopped, every time the gallery fell silent and a listener leaned toward the wall, the true nature of the job returned. They were not simply making a tunnel. They were entering a contest with men they could not see, in a battlefield where the first clear sign of defeat might be the roof coming down. The next thing to understand is that listening was not a break from the work. It was the work in its most concentrated form. Digging moved the tunnel forward, but listening decided whether forward was still possible. A good listener could save a gallery. A missed sound could kill everyone in it. In the underground war, ears became instruments, silence became equipment, and the earth itself became the wall through which two armies tried to read each other's intentions. Listening underground was not passive. It was not a man resting with his ear against a wall, while other men did the real work. In the tunnelling war, listening was one of the most important jobs a man could be given, because the whole system depended on knowing what the enemy was doing before the enemy knew what you were doing. Digging moved a gallery forward, timber held it open, pumps kept water from claiming it, and ventilation kept men conscious long enough to work. But listening decided whether the work could continue at all. A tunnel might be well made, carefully surveyed, properly timbered, and almost at its objective, and still be lost because a German countermine came too close without being detected. A listener could save weeks of labour and the lives of the men in the gallery. He could warn the trench above that the enemy was charging a mine. He could tell his own tunnellers when to stop, when to move, when to prepare a camouflage, and when the safe ground ahead had become dangerous. He did all of this with almost nothing to look at. No battlefield spread before him, no enemy helmet above a parapet. No flash of rifle fire, just earth, silence, and the difficult task of deciding whether a faint sound was natural, harmless, or the beginning of disaster. Think about the pressure of that for a moment. A man at a listening post might sit or kneel for hours in a narrow gallery driven out beneath no man's land. The candle beside him might be low. The air might be sour enough to make thinking harder than it should be. His clothes might be damp, his knees might ache. He might be cold in one part of his body and sweating in another. Behind him, somewhere along the gallery, men are waiting for his judgment. Above him, infantrymen are standing in trenches that may be the enemy's target. Somewhere ahead, perhaps to one side, perhaps a little below or above, German miners may be working toward the same piece of ground. If he reports a sound that is not there, work may stop, time may be lost, men may be ordered into danger unnecessarily, and officers may begin to doubt him. If he misses a real sound, the tunnel may be blown in. That is a particular kind of responsibility. It does not look heroic from the outside. It looks like stillness. But it is the stillness of a man holding other men's lives in his ears. At first, the methods were simple because war so often begins by improvising. Men listened with the naked ear. They pressed their heads to the side of a gallery, or to a timber, or to some object placed against the ground in the hope that vibration would travel through it. Water in a glass could show tremors. A rod, an auger, a tube, or a simple stethoscope-like arrangement might help carry sound. These were not foolish methods. They came from the practical intelligence of men who had spent years underground or around machinery and knew that solid things carry sound differently from air. Put your ear against a railway line and you may hear a train before you see it. Put your ear against a wall and you may hear a room that would seem silent if you stood away from it. Underground, that same principle became military practice. The earth was not empty, it was a conductor. It carried blows, scrapes, dragging, walking, hammering, running water, collapsing soil, and the restless small noises of the trench world above. The listener's task was not simply to hear, it was to sort. That sorting was difficult because the battlefield was never truly quiet. Even when the tunnel itself stopped work, the world above continued. Men walked on duckboards, sentries shifted their weight, a rifle bolt clicked, a trench mortar fired, a shell burst somewhere in the distance and rolled through the ground as a dull pressure rather than a clean sound. Rats moved through the trench system and through old workings. Water dripped, timber settled. A loose board tapped with each vibration from above. A man in the trench might stamp his feet because they were numb, and below him that small human movement could become a report in the earth. It is easy to imagine silence underground as total, but the listener knew a different truth. Silence was full of distractions. The danger was not that there was nothing to hear. The danger was that there was too much, and much of it meant nothing until suddenly one sound meant everything. Then came the geophone, and with it a more precise form of listening. A geophone was not magic, though to a frightened infantryman above ground it may have seemed close to it. It was an instrument for detecting vibrations through the earth, and in the hands of an experienced listener, it could help locate the direction of enemy digging. Some wartime descriptions speak of paired discs connected by tubes to earpieces, a simple-looking arrangement that required a practiced ear and a calm mind. The listener would place the two sensors against the ground and compare the sound in each ear, shifting the position until the sound reached him with equal strength. From that he could take a bearing. With observations from more than one point, men could estimate where the enemy activity lay. The description sounds almost neat. Put down the discs, listen, compare, plot the line, find the enemy. But nothing in the tunnel was that clean. The listener's body was uncomfortable, the candle was weak, the sounds were faint. The enemy did not work continuously. The battlefield interfered. The imagination interfered. The geophone gave better information, but it did not remove fear from the act of judgment. That last point matters because experience was everything. A device could make sound audible, but it could not decide what the sound meant. A nervous man could hear too much. A tired man could hear too little. A man with a lively imagination could turn every vibration into German miners with a charge already placed. A man who had become too used to ordinary noise might dismiss something important. The best listeners were not simply those with sharp hearing. They were men with steadiness, patience, memory, and the ability to remain mentally exact in conditions designed to make exactness difficult. They had to know the local ground. Sound in chalk did not behave exactly like sound in clay. Water changed things, depth changed things, timber changed things. A pick, a shovel, a mattock, a tram, drag in sandbags, tamp in a charge, men walking overhead, all could have different qualities. The listener built a private library of sounds, and he built it under pressure. There is something almost lonely about that work. Other tunnelling tasks were shared in obvious ways. The kicker worked with the bagger with the trammer, the timbermen with those passing material forward. Even dangerous labour had a rhythm of cooperation. Listening could also be organised and reported, but the decisive act happened inside one man's attention. He had to concentrate while everyone else waited. He had to trust himself without becoming arrogant. He had to know when to say, yes, there is something there. He also had to know when to say, no, keep working. Both answers had consequences. In an infantry attack, courage might be visible. Men saw who climbed the parapet. Men saw who carried a wounded friend. Men saw who stayed when others moved back. Underground listening rarely gave courage a public shape. The listener's bravery was mostly the refusal to let fear distort what he heard. Imagine him near the end of a gallery, after the men have been ordered to stop work. The last bag of spoil has been moved back. The tools are down. Someone has covered a lamp slightly so the light does not distract. Men are still in the tunnel behind him, but they have become part of the background, breathing as softly as tired bodies can manage. He adjusts the earpieces. He places the sensors against the ground. At first, he hears the tunnel itself because one always hears the place one is in. A small settling in the timber. A distant movement. Perhaps a muffled thud from artillery far above. Then he waits. He may hear nothing for several minutes. Nothing is never simple, because nothing might mean safety, or it might mean that the enemy has stopped because he is listening too. Then comes a faint, irregular scrape. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is a small violation of the silence. He holds still. There it is again. Perhaps a pick. Perhaps a tool working in clay. Perhaps something else. He shifts the instrument, compares the sound, tries to find the direction. Behind him, no one asks questions. They know better. He listens until the sound stops. Then the waiting becomes worse, because stopping can mean many things. Men rest, men change shifts, men notice something, men prepare a charge. In the underground war, silence after sound could be more frightening than sound itself. Reports reduce this experience to short phrases: enemy working heard, picking faint, intermittent, direction so many degrees, estimated distance uncertain, no hostile sound, tamping suspected. These reports were necessary because armies need records and technical work needs communication, but there is a terrible compression in them. A report could turn hours of bodily strain into one line. A man's fear, patience, doubt and concentration became a few words passed to officers who had to decide what to do with them. Continue the gallery, halt work, open a branch, prepare a camouflage, warn the infantry, withdraw men from a section. Every report entered the machinery of decisions. The listener's small sentence could change the movement of men above and below ground. When enemy sounds seemed close or threatening, defensive mining came into play. A camouflage was not meant to create the great surface crater that people often associate with mine warfare. It was usually intended to destroy an underground working, to collapse a section of enemy gallery, kill or trap the men inside it, and make the ground difficult or impossible to use. The word itself can almost sound technical enough to hide what it did, but in practice a camouflage was a buried fist. If listeners detected German work approaching, a small spur might be driven toward the sound, a charge placed, tamped, and fired before the enemy could complete his own mine. Sometimes a charge might be kept ready for quick use. Sometimes both sides were trying to get close enough to destroy the other without breaking the surface. This was tunneler against tunneler, not in the clear form of a duel, but in a blind underground contest where the first man to judge distance correctly might live, and the other might vanish. The cruelty of this lay partly in its intimacy, and partly in its uncertainty. A man firing a camouflage might never see what it had done. He might hear the dull underground blow, feel the shock, smell the dust and fumes, and then wait to see whether enemy sounds ceased. If the sound stopped, that might mean success. It might mean men were dead, trapped, stunned, or withdrawing. If tapping began afterward, what did that mean? Rescue, signals, survivors. The war rarely allowed a clean moral distance, but underground it made the distance stranger. Men killed men they knew only as vibrations. They saved their own comrades by collapsing earth on someone else's. None of this made them monsters. It made them soldiers inside a system that had turned mining knowledge into a method of murder. That is why this story should be told plainly. The tunnellers were skilled and brave. They were also engaged in work whose purpose was often to bury other men before those men buried them. Sometimes listening became a form of reassurance for the infantry above. A battalion holding a nervous stretch of line might ask whether enemy mining was suspected. Men in the trench wanted to know what was happening under them, though the truth did not always comfort them. If the listeners reported nothing, perhaps the infantry slept a little easier, though even no sound had to be trusted. If suspicious sounds were found, the whole mood of a trench could change. Men might be ordered to keep quiet, to reduce movement, to prepare for a possible blow, or to withdraw from a bay when tactical circumstances allowed. At other times they had to stay. That may be one of the hardest things to imagine, being told that enemy mining was possible beneath your position and still being required to hold it. Trench warfare demanded many forms of obedience, but few were as psychologically strange as standing on ground that trained men believed might be hollowing underneath you. The listeners also had to contend with deception, whether deliberate or accidental. Both sides learned that noise mattered. The British often had an advantage in clay because clay kicking was quieter than the methods used by many German tunnellers, but no side could assume the enemy was careless. Men might stop work when they suspected they were being heard. They might make noise elsewhere. They might drive a gallery at a different level. They might use the noise of artillery, trench mortars, or surface activity to cover underground work. Even ordinary battlefield rhythm could conceal things. During bombardments, delicate listening became much harder. During quiet nights, the smallest underground sounds became clearer but also more unnerving. Weather, soil, depth, equipment, and enemy habits all shaped the listener's world. He was not hearing a simple signal. He was interpreting a battlefield through a wall. As the underground war developed, listening systems became more elaborate. Central listening stations could collect information from multiple sensors, allowing fewer men to monitor a wider underground area. This sounds modern, almost clinical, but it belonged to the same muddy world as everything else. Wires, sensors, instruments, and trained ears entered the trench system alongside rats, water, sandbags, and shell fire. Technology did not make the war clean. It made the dirty war more efficient. A central station could improve coverage, but someone still had to interpret the sounds. Someone still had to decide whether a faint vibration was enemy work, surface movement, water, settling timber, or imagination sharpened by fear. The First World War is full of such combinations. Ancient fear paired with new machinery, old siegecraft paired with electrical instruments, human nerves stretched through technical systems. The best listeners were valuable men, and everyone around them knew it. A reckless digger could endanger a working. A poor listener could lose one. But the strain on them must have been considerable. Listening was not only physical discomfort, it was a tension without release. A man doing heavy labour could at least feel the direct relation between effort and result. The tunnel lengthened, the bag filled, the timber went in, the pump cleared water. Listening offered less satisfaction. Hours might produce only uncertainty. A man might come off duty with a report that said nothing definite, and yet he had spent the entire time under tension. The nervous system does not care whether the report was exciting. It knows only that the body sat in danger listening for death in the dark. There were probably men who became known for calm reports, men whose word carried weight because they had been right before. There were probably others no one fully trusted. In a small underground company, reputations form quickly. Men notice who panics, who guesses, who keeps steady, who can still think when air is bad and the roof has shifted. The listener's authority was earned in the quietest possible way, not by talking, but by hearing correctly. It is easy to imagine the anger that might follow a false alarm, especially among exhausted men ordered to stop work or shift direction. It is also easy to imagine how quickly that anger would disappear if, hours later, a charge went off where he said the enemy had been. Underground, being right mattered more than being liked. One of the most frightening sounds was not always the pick. It was the sound that suggested charging and tamping. Digging had rhythms. So did preparing a mine. If enemy tunnellers had reached their chamber and begun bringing in explosives or packing the gallery to contain the blast, the listener might hear dragging, shuffling, muffled handling, then perhaps silence. That sequence could mean the enemy was nearly ready to fire. A warning at that moment might save men above, but it might come too late for those underground. The listeners had to distinguish not only presence, but intention. Were the Germans advancing a gallery, repairing damage, abandoning work, loading a chamber, preparing a camouflage? The same earth that carried sound also blurred it. The enemy did not send explanations through the clay. He sent fragments, and the listener built a likely story from them. There is a human temptation to imagine that terror must be loud. We connect fear with explosions, screams, alarms, and visible destruction. But in the tunnelling war, some of the worst fear gathered around faintness. A barely audible tap could empty a man's mouth of moisture. A sound too soft to prove could keep a gallery frozen. A vibration that came and went could be worse than a clear threat because uncertainty spreads through the mind. The listener existed in that uncertainty as a profession. He had to remain useful inside it. That may be one reason tunnellers were regarded with such respect by many who understood their work. They did not simply endure danger, they learned to read it in its smallest forms. There were moments when the listening post itself must have felt far removed from the human world. The man alone or nearly alone at the end of a narrow underground branch, the candle guttering, the instrument touching the ground, the trench boards far above, the occasional artillery vibration passing through the earth like weather, the sense of another set of men somewhere beyond reach doing the same thing. In that place, national slogans and public speeches would have seemed very far away. The listener did not hear empire, honour or strategy. He heard clay, he heard tools, he heard rats, he heard his own breathing and tried not to hear too much of his own imagination. The grand causes of the war narrowed to the question of whether the sound was stronger in one ear than the other, and yet the consequences of that question could be enormous. A correctly located enemy gallery might be destroyed before it reached a British trench. A missed gallery could lead to a mine explosion that tore open the line and killed infantry who never knew they had been listened for and not found. A warning that the enemy was ready to fire might allow men to evacuate just in time. A wrong direction could send a defensive spur away from the real danger. This was not guesswork dressed up as science, but it was not certainty either. It was skilled judgment under conditions where certainty was rare. That is the space where much of war actually happens, not in clear knowledge, but in decisions made from incomplete signs. The infantry above may have heard rumours of these reports. Men in a trench were intensely interested in anything that concerned survival. If a tunneler came up from below and spoke quietly to an officer, eyes followed him. If orders changed after that, men noticed. Perhaps a section was cleared. Perhaps movement was restricted. Perhaps nothing happened, which could be more unsettling than action. The ordinary soldier might not understand geophone bearings or the technical language of mining reports, but he understood enough to know that there was another battle below him. Some men probably preferred not to think about it. Others could not stop thinking about it. A man can become used to many things, but becoming used to being undermined is a different matter. It attacks the imagination from below. For the tunnelers themselves, listening was part of the rhythm of survival. Dig, stop, listen. Advance, stop, listen. Timber, listen. Hear something, stop everything. Hear nothing, continue. The pattern repeated until it became ordinary, which did not mean it became easy. The mind can normalise almost anything through repetition, but the body keeps its own record. A man who had spent hours listening might later start at small household sounds after the war, a knock in the wall, a footstep above, a pipe settling. We cannot know every private aftermath, but it would be strange if such work left no echo. Human beings do not spend months learning to hear death through earth and then simply forget the language. At times, the two underground systems came so close that direct encounter was possible. The image is almost unbearable. Men who have known each other only as sound suddenly breaking into the same space. In some cases, there were fights with pistols, grenades, bayonets, or whatever could be used in the cramped dark. But even when no breakthrough occurred, the possibility lived in the tunnel. The wall ahead was not just earth. It might be the last barrier before the enemy. This made listening more than detection. It was a way of maintaining that barrier. So long as you could hear him, locate him, and act before he arrived, the enemy remained on the other side of the earth. Misjudge him, and he might enter your world all at once through explosion, collapse, or a hole no wider than a man's shoulders. The official records of mining warfare often give us the action after the listening. Mine fired, camouflage blown, enemy activity silenced, gallery damaged, casualties unknown. But if we slow down before those results, we find the listener at the centre of the process. He is the point where hidden enemy labour first becomes known. He is the man who turns vibration into warning. Without him, the tunnel is nearly blind. With him, it is still afraid, but not helpless. That distinction mattered. In a war where so many men felt acted upon by machines and orders beyond their control, the tunnelers' listening post offered one narrow form of agency. Hear first, understand first, strike first if necessary, survive one more shift. Near the end of a long night underground, after hours of listening and reports, a man might climb back toward the trench with the sound still inside his head. The ladder up the shaft might feel awkward under tired legs. The air near the top might be cold and smoky and wonderful. He might emerge into a front line that looked terrible by ordinary standards but open compared to the listening post. Men above might be stamping their feet, whispering, cleaning rifles, waiting for dawn, cursing the cold. Somewhere a machine gun might fire a short burst. Somewhere a flare might rise and fall over no man's land. He had been under that same ground, trying to hear the enemy beneath all of it. And after a little rest, perhaps after tea, perhaps after sleep that did not fully release him, he would go back down. The listening did not stop because the enemy did not stop. Every tunnel on one side encouraged a response from the other. Every suspected sound demanded interpretation. Every silence had to be treated carefully. This was the hidden front at its most concentrated. Two groups of men in darkness, neither able to see the other, both trying to measure distance through fear and vibration. They were miners, engineers, soldiers, and listeners of the earth. And when the listening failed, or when it succeeded too late, the tunnel could change in a second from workplace to trap. The next part of this story belongs to that moment, when the roof came down, the air filled with dust, the lamps went out, and men learned whether the passage they had trusted would open again or keep them forever. The tunnel did not always announce its failure with a great roar. Sometimes the first warning was smaller than that. A little movement in the roof, a grainy sound above the head, timber taking pressure with a long complaining creak, clay shifting behind the boards in a way experienced miners understood immediately, and inexperienced men only understood when they saw the faces of those who knew. In a trench, danger often arrived from outside the body's expectations. A shell burst, a rifle cracked, a flare rose, a machine gun opened. Underground, danger often began inside the walls. The place that had been holding you changed its mind. The roof pressed lower, the side squeezed inward. A support moved a fraction, and in that small change, every man in the gallery knew that the tunnel was not a passage by right. It was a temporary bargain with the earth, and the earth did not owe them another minute. This is the part of tunnelling that is hardest to think about for very long. Not the explosion itself, not the military purpose, not even the knowledge that the enemy was somewhere close. It is the moment after something has gone wrong, when the lamp is out or nearly out, the air is full of dust, the way back is blocked, and the men who had spent their shift moving slowly toward enemy trenches realise that they are no longer moving anywhere. The tunnel has become a tomb, but not completely, not yet. Because in the first minutes after a collapse, there may still be air, there may still be voices, there may still be injured men trying to answer, there may still be tapping from the far side of the fall, there may still be enough hope to make rescue possible, and that hope may be the cruelest thing in the whole underground war. A collapse could happen for many reasons. The enemy could fire a camouflage close enough to crush the gallery without breaking the surface. Shellfire above could disturb shallow workings. Water could weaken the clay or sand around the timber. A badly judged support could fail. Old workings could shift. The pressure of the earth could simply become too much for the materials and the men trying to hold it back. In civilian mining, every one of these dangers was known. Men had died in coal mines, tin mines, sewer works, railway tunnels, and construction shafts long before the armies of 1914 brought miners to the Western Front. But war changed the meaning of accident. Underground at the front, a fall might be caused by geology, bad luck, enemy action, or some combination no one could separate afterward. It did not matter much to the trapped men. Whether the gallery came down because of a German charge or because wet ground gave way, the result was the same. Darkness, dust, broken timber, a passage blocked where the passage had been. The human body is not built to accept that calmly. We are creatures of exits. We do not like rooms without doors. A tunneler lived with the knowledge that his exit might disappear behind him in a second. Imagine the first moments after a camouflage. There is a dull underground blow, not always the theatrical explosion people imagine. but a heavy, compressed violence that travels through the gallery and enters the body before the mind has named it. The air punches, the lamp jumps or goes out, timber cracks, clay and chalk burst inward. Men are thrown down in a space where there is hardly room to fall. Someone shouts, then coughs because the air has turned to dust. Someone else is silent in a way that makes the others afraid to call his name too quickly. The passage behind may be blocked. The passage ahead may be blocked. The blast may have created fumes that cannot be breathed safely. The men who are still conscious take stock with whatever part of their minds remains useful. Who is alive? Who is hurt? Can anyone move? Where is the lamp? Is there air? Can the shaft be reached? Is the enemy going to fire again? The questions come faster than answers. In the dark, the old routine of tunnelling becomes a different routine. Not cut, bag, pass back, timber, listen. Now it is breathe, feel, call, dig, wait, tap, conserve strength. Dust was its own enemy. A tunnel collapse could fill the gallery with powdered earth and timber splinters so thick that a man could not see the hand in front of his face even if the lamp survived. Dust entered the mouth and nose. It coated the throat. Men coughed, and coughing used air. A man trying to stay calm might cover his mouth with cloth, but cloth was likely wet, dirty, and useless after a while. In that first darkness, the mind could create its own terrors. A trapped man might not know whether the roof above him was stable. He might hear more shifting and wonder if the pocket he occupied was about to close completely. He might hear an injured comrade breathing badly. He might smell fumes from the explosion or from a lamp. The body wants to move in a situation like that. It wants to push, crawl, claw, strike at the blockage, do anything that feels like action. But frantic movement could bring down more earth, injure men further, waste air, or exhaust the only men still capable of digging. Survival required the thing fear hates most: control. On the safe side of the fall, if there was a safe side, rescue began almost immediately. Men in the shaft or main gallery would hear the blast, feel the shock, see dust rush out, and know before anyone said it that men might be trapped ahead. Rescue underground was not a matter of simply digging hard. Hard digging in unstable ground can kill the men you are trying to save. The rescuers had to clear broken clay and timber while supporting the passage as they went, because the fall that had happened once might happen again. They had to work in bad air. They had to manage water, fumes, and darkness. They had to listen for men beyond the blockage, and if they heard tapping or voices, hope sharpened the work and made every delay feel unbearable. At the same time, the war above did not pause out of respect. The shaft head might be shelled. Enemy mortars might fire on the area. Trenches needed to be held. Orders still came. Men trying to rescue tunnellers underground might be interrupted by bombardment or by the danger that the entrance itself would be destroyed. That is one of the ugliest details of this kind of rescue. The men trapped below were in a crisis, but the battlefield around them remained a battlefield. Communication through a fall of earth could be painfully limited. Tapping became a language because sometimes it was all that could pass between the trapped and the rescuers. A pipe, a timber, a tool, the wall of the gallery itself, anything that carried vibration might become a signal. A tap could mean we are here. Repeated taps could mean still alive. The absence of tapping could mean sleep, injury, weakness, death, distance, or simply that the sound no longer carried. That uncertainty worked on the men outside as much as the men inside. To dig towards silence is one thing. To dig toward faint tapping is another. It turns the fall into a clock. Every minute matters because the trapped men have only the air sealed in with them, and no one can know exactly how much remains. If the pocket is large, if the men are calm, if the air is not fouled by gas or fumes, they may last longer. If the space is small, if they are injured, if carbon monoxide has entered, time shortens. Rescue parties had to work while imagining all of this. They had to keep their hands steady while their minds counted breaths they could not hear. Being trapped underground did not always mean being instantly crushed. That may be what makes it so disturbing. Some men died at once under the fall, but others lived for hours, sometimes longer, in pockets beyond collapsed sections. They might hear the rescue party working toward them. They might answer. They might even speak through small openings if the fall could be pierced. In those cases, hope became a physical thing in the gallery. Men outside could hear the living. Men inside could hear rescue. Both sides might believe that a few more feet, a few more boards, a few more hours would be enough. Then another fall could undo everything. A hole opened through the debris might begin to close as pressure shifted. A wounded man might be too badly hurt to move through it. A rescuer might be able to reach one trapped man but not another. Decisions made in that narrow space were not the clean decisions of stories. They were cramped, pressured, breathless, and often made with the roof moving. This is where the story of Sapper William Hackett belongs, not as a decoration or a heroic pause, but as one clear example of what this work could ask of a man. Hackett was a miner before the war, older than many soldiers, and by 1916 he was serving with 254 Tunnelling Company of the Royal Engineers near Givenchy-lès-la-Bassée. In June of that year, a German mine explosion damaged the British underground work at Shaftesbury Avenue, cutting off Hackett and several others below ground. The details matter because they are so plain. Men were trapped. A rescue party worked toward them. After many hours, an opening was made. Hackett helped others get through to safety. He could have followed. Instead, he stayed with Private Thomas Collins, a young Welsh soldier who was badly injured and could not be brought out easily. The opening was unstable. Time was running out. The gallery was dangerous. Hackett refused to leave the injured man. Later accounts give him words to the effect that he was a tunneler and had to look after the others first. Whether spoken exactly as remembered or shaped by the way men preserve courage after death, the meaning is not difficult to understand. In that moment, underground, duty was not an idea. It was a man refusing the hole that led upward because another man could not yet pass through it. Then the ground moved again. The rescue failed. Hackett and Collins remained buried beneath the field. The memorial at Givenchy remembers both of them, and it is worth noticing one detail about that memorial. Its dimensions reflect the cramped size of the galleries in which tunnellers worked. That is not merely symbolic. It forces the memory into the body. We're used to memorials that rise upward, tall enough to be seen, shaped for public space and ceremony. A tunneller's memorial that recalls the narrow proportions of a mine gallery asks you to understand something else, the smallness of the place where courage happened. Hackett did not die in a wide field under a flag. He died in a constricted underground working beside an injured man, with rescue close enough to imagine and not close enough to save. There is no need to make that more dramatic than it is. The plain version is almost too much. What happened to Hackett and Collins was exceptional, in the sense that it was recorded and later honoured. It was not exceptional in the sense that tunnels killed men this way. Many tunnellers died underground without leaving a story that could be easily told. A collapse might bury men whose names entered casualty lists but whose final minutes were known only to those trapped with them, if anyone survived. Some bodies could not be recovered. Some galleries were too dangerous to reopen. Some were later destroyed by further fighting. A man could disappear under the front and be remembered on a memorial to the missing, while the place where he actually lay remained beneath farmland, cratered ground, or a rebuilt landscape. The First World War made many men missing above ground, but underground missing has a particular weight. It means not only that the body was not found, it means the earth closed around the circumstances. The rescuers carried their own burden. Men who dug toward trapped comrades often did so knowing they might bring the tunnel down on themselves. They had to move quickly and carefully, two demands that do not like each other. They might hear men ahead and still be unable to reach them. They might make an opening and be forced back by gas, shell fire, or another fall. They might later have to stop because continuing would kill more men without saving the trapped. That decision, to stop rescue work must have been among the worst an officer or mining team could face. On paper, it could be justified by conditions: the shaft unsafe, air foul, enemy action continuing, no further sound heard. In the minds of the men who'd been digging, it would not remain paper. They would remember where the tapping had come from. They would remember the last voice if there had been one. They would remember the place in the tunnel where hope ended. There is a line people sometimes use about war, that the dead were buried where they fell. For tunnellers, that could be literally true in a way most soldiers would have found difficult to imagine. Infantrymen were sometimes buried by shell fire or lost in mud, but they had usually fallen under the open sky, even if that sky was smoke-filled and hostile. A tunneler might be buried in the very passage he had helped make. The work and the grave were the same. The timber he had passed forward might become part of the debris around him. The clay he had cut so carefully might press back against his body. The silence he had relied on to hide from the enemy might become the silence that hid him from rescue. That reversal is what gives the tunneler's story its particular cruelty. Their skill depended on trusting the underground world enough to work in it. Their fear came from knowing exactly how little that trust could be worth. The infantry above were not untouched by these losses. Tunnel collapse beneath the line could send rumours through a battalion. Men would ask who was trapped, whether rescue was possible, whether the enemy had fired the charge, whether their own trench was still safe. If a mine exploded under a nearby position, those not killed might be left with the fear that their own section would be next. The ground became a thing with intentions in the imagination, even though everyone knew it was men doing the digging and firing. There is no comfort in knowing the danger is man-made when you cannot see the men making it. In a trench, a soldier could sometimes look over the parapet through a periscope and see the enemy line. He could map the threat onto something visible. Underground mining removed that comfort. The enemy had become a sound underfoot, then a blast, then a crater, then a burial. That sequence was enough to make the most ordinary stretch of trench feel haunted while the war was still happening. The trapped men themselves had to manage time differently. Time underground during ordinary work could become a blur of tasks. Time after a collapse became measured in air, pain, sound, and effort. A man might try to make himself breathe slowly. He might tell an injured comrade to stay awake. He might take turns tapping. He might try to clear loose earth with his hands, only to realise that digging in the wrong place would bring more down. He might talk to keep fear from growing too large. What did men say in those pockets? Some accounts preserve fragments from particular incidents, but most moments vanished. Perhaps they spoke of rescue. Perhaps they cursed. Perhaps they prayed. Perhaps they said the names of wives, mothers, children, workmates. Perhaps they said very little because the air was bad and speech cost too much. History often cannot give us the exact words, and when it cannot, we should resist inventing too much. What we can say is enough. Men waited in the dark for other men to dig them out. There were practical rescue techniques, and there was raw desperation. Men drove new headings around a fall, shored up broken passages, cleared debris by hand, forced air forward where possible, and listened constantly. Rescue was another form of tunnelling under worse conditions. The men doing it could not forget the trapped men ahead. Every bag of spoil removed might be the one that opened a pocket. Every delay might be the one that cost a life. The rescuers also had to think about the enemy. A German mine that had collapsed one section might be followed by another. Enemy listening could detect rescue work. Surface shelling could make the shaft dangerous. The rescue party therefore worked inside a double urgency. Save the men quickly, but do not create another burial. It is hard to imagine a more punishing kind of labour. Gas and fumes made the aftermath of explosions especially dangerous. A tunnel that looked physically passable might not be breathable. Carbon monoxide is particularly treacherous because it can overcome men without the dramatic warning people expect. Lamps might behave strangely, but by the time men understood the air was bad, they might already be impaired. The tunnelling companies learned, as miners had learned before them, that rescue after an explosion could produce more casualties if men rushed in without caution. This created another cruel delay. The trapped needed help immediately, but the rescuers had to protect themselves or there would be no rescue at all. In an underground emergency, bravery without method could become another form of waste. The best rescuers were not those who ignored danger, they were those who could enter danger with enough discipline to remain useful. The physical shape of the galleries made every rescue harder. These were not generous tunnels. In the Flanders clays, many mine galleries were built to dimensions that forced a man to crouch, crawl, or work in awkward positions. A stretcher could not simply be carried forward in the way it might in a trench. An injured man might have to be dragged, lifted, twisted, or pass through a constricted opening while the roof shifted around him. A small hole through a fall might be large enough for an uninjured man to squeeze through, but too small for someone with a broken leg, crushed chest, or injured back. That seems to have been part of the agony in rescues like the one at Givenchy. Safety might be inches away in one sense and unreachable in another. A man could see or hear the way out and still be trapped by the simple fact of his wounded body. If a collapse happened near the enemy, rescue might also reveal the position. Noise was unavoidable when men were digging urgently through broken ground. The enemy might hear it. He might fire another camera flea. He might shell the shaft head if he knew or guessed where it was. The rescue of buried men could therefore become part of the tactical struggle. This is one of those facts that feels almost indecent from a distance, but war is full of indecent practicalities. A trapped man's life mattered to his comrades. The enemy's mine work mattered to the enemy. The surface position mattered to both. The war did not step aside for mercy as often as human beings wished it would. When mercy appeared, it usually came through the hands of exhausted men working anyway. Afterward, the tunnel might be sealed, repaired, abandoned, or fought over again. The dead, if recovered, might be buried behind the lines. If not, the gallery remained their grave. Men still had to continue nearby. That continuation is another hard thing to understand. A tunneler might lose friends in a collapse and later be ordered into another gallery. Not because the loss meant nothing, but because the system required the work to go on. Armies absorb grief by assigning another task. The individual man may not absorb it so easily. He may remember the sound of the fall every time timber creaks. He may remember the tapping. He may remember who came out covered in dust and who did not. He may learn to say very little because there is no useful place for such memory in the daily routine of war. Then he climbs down again. The fear of burial did not remove the need for precision. If anything, it made precision more necessary. Men checked timber, watched the roof, listened, controlled noise, moved spoil, and respected experienced warnings because they knew the consequences. A careless man underground endangered everyone. The tunnel allowed no private mistakes. Above ground, a man might make an error that affected only himself or the man beside him. Underground, one mistake could block the only way out for the whole team. This produced a severe kind of discipline. Not the discipline of polished boots and straight lines, but the discipline of survival in a shared narrow space. Men who could not follow it were dangerous. Men who could become trusted. It is important not to imagine the tunnelers as constantly terrified in an obvious way. Men cannot function like that for long. Fear becomes part of the furniture of the job. It sits there. It is known. It is consulted when necessary and ignored when possible. A tunneler might joke at the shaft mouth, complain about food, argue over a small irritation, smoke quietly, or fall asleep with mud still on him. He was not always thinking about being buried alive. But the possibility was never absent. It waited in the creak of timber, the sudden rush of dust, the order to stop and listen, the news from another sector, the empty place where a man from the last shift should have been. The mind makes room for danger by making it ordinary, and that ordinariness is often what later generations find most difficult to accept. When we say the tunnel became a tomb, we should be careful not to make the phrase too neat. It did not become a tomb all at once for everyone. For the dead, yes. For the trapped, not immediately. For the rescuers, it became a question. Can we reach them? Are they alive? Is the passage safe? For the officers, it became a decision. Continue or stop? Risk more men or accept the loss? For the infantry above, it became a rumour, a tremor, a crater, a warning. For the families at home, it became a telegram or a letter that could not possibly explain what had happened under a field in France. Missing, killed in action, died of wounds, awarded for gallantry. Words with official shapes placed over events that had no shape anyone at home could easily picture. And then there were the fields themselves. After the war, some of these places remained marked by craters and memorials. Others softened under grass, cultivation, rebuilding, and time. But the underground war did not vanish simply because the surface world resumed. Collapsed galleries remained below. Unrecovered bodies remained below. In some places, unexploded charges or forgotten workings became part of the hidden inheritance of the Western Front. A farmer might work land above a buried battlefield. A visitor might stand at a memorial without fully grasping that men still lay beneath nearby ground, not in a cemetery, but where the tunnel kept them. That knowledge changes the way a landscape feels. It turns an ordinary field into a layered place, with peace above and war still sealed below. The tunnellers knew better than most that the ground could remember. They had dug through old workings, through disturbed soil, through places already altered by previous fighting. Each new tunnel entered not fresh earth, but a record of what had been done there before. A collapse added another layer, a mine chamber added another, a crater added another. The battlefield became vertical as well as horizontal, trenches at the surface, dugouts below, mine galleries below those, listening posts reaching out, German workings crossing or approaching, collapses, charges, water, gas, and human remains, all occupying different levels of the same torn ground. This was not simply a front line. It was a buried city of violence, built by men who often saw only the few feet in front of their lamps. From those narrow tombs, the logic of underground war kept expanding. If a small mine could destroy a listening post, a larger mine could wreck a trench. If a charge under a strongpoint could help an assault, a system of great mines under a ridge might open an entire battle. The same skills that trapped men in small galleries were also being used to prepare explosions on a scale that seemed almost beyond the old language of mining. Deep beneath Messines Ridge, tunnellers worked for months in secrecy, creating chambers packed with explosives under German positions. The work still depended on the same things: silence, measurement, air, timber, spoil, listening, nerve. But the purpose grew larger, and with it the consequences. The hidden front was about to rise through the surface in a way men miles away would feel. Deep beneath Messines Ridge, the war became patient in a way that almost feels impossible to reconcile with what happened there in the early morning of June 7th, 1917. Above ground, Messines was a ridge south of Ypres, not a mountain, not some dramatic height that would impress a traveller from a distance, but in the flat and broken country of Flanders, even a modest ridge mattered. It gave the German army observation over the British lines in the Ypres salient. It let them look down into positions that already felt exposed enough. From that higher ground, enemy observers could direct artillery, watch movement, study roads, communication trenches, supply routes, and the daily patterns of men who would have preferred not to be seen at all. In a landscape where a few feet of elevation could change everything, Messines Ridge was not just ground, it was advantage. And for years men had died beneath its view. So when the British planned to take it, they did not think only in terms of infantry crossing open ground. They had tried that kind of war again and again, and had learned what machine guns, artillery, wire and prepared defences could do to men moving forward in daylight or under flare light. At Messines, they prepared a different answer. They would go under the ridge before they went over it. The work began long before the infantry attack. That is one of the most important things to understand. The explosion at Messines lasted only moments. The digging that made it possible took months, and in some places far longer. Tunnellers had been working in the region since 1915, and by 1916 the mining plan under the Messines-Wytschaty Ridge had become one of the largest underground operations of the war. Men went down shafts, drove galleries through blue clay, laid out branches, listened for German counterminers, fought water, bad air, pressure, exhaustion, and the constant possibility of being found. They worked at depths that could reach around 80 to 120 feet below the surface in places, deep enough to hide the true galleries from some German detection, and deep enough to make the work a serious engineering problem. Above them were trenches, farms reduced to names on maps, shell holes, wire, shattered trees, and villages that had become military positions. Below all of that, the tunnellers built a hidden system aimed at selected points under the German front. If you looked at the battlefield from above, you might see ruin. If you could somehow see through the ground, you would see intention. The ridge had to be mined with secrecy, and secrecy underground was hard labour. Every shaft entrance had to be concealed or protected. Every load of timber, pipe, cable, tool and explosive had to be brought forward, without giving away the scale of the operation. Every bag of spoil had to be removed or hidden. Men had to keep digging quietly, even when they knew the Germans were listening and sometimes countermining. The German army was not ignorant of underground warfare. German tunnellers had been active and dangerous from early in the conflict. They had destroyed Allied galleries before. They had fired camouflages. They had listened through the same earth. At Messines, the British plan depended partly on depth and deception. Some shallower activity helped draw German attention upward, while deeper galleries continued below. That detail matters because it shows how much of the battle was fought before the battle officially began. The infantry assault would take place on a date and at an hour. The underground battle had already been happening in darkness for months. The men who dug there came from tunnelling companies of the Royal Engineers and from the wider Imperial forces, British miners, Canadian tunnellers, Australian tunnellers, New Zealand tunnellers, men who had worked underground in civilian life, and men who had learned the work in war, all contributed to the system beneath the ridge. Their labour was international in the practical way of the British war effort. A Welsh miner might work near a Canadian. An Australian engineer might take over work begun by a British company. A New Zealander might move through a gallery whose direction had been planned by men from somewhere he had never seen. Underground, national identity mattered less than whether a man could do the job. Could he work quietly? Could he read the ground? Could he move spoil without wasting time? Could he keep his head when a listener raised a hand? Could he continue after a fall, after gas, after news that a nearby gallery had been damaged? Messines was not the achievement of one dramatic figure. It was the result of thousands of skilled and tired actions performed by men whose names rarely appear when the battle is summarised. The clay under Messines was one reason the plan could be attempted on such a scale. In the right conditions, clay held tunnels better than loose sand and allowed men to work with methods that reduced noise. But clay was not a friend. It was heavy, damp and unforgiving. It clung to clothing and skin. It made tools slick. It narrowed space. It held the smell of men working too long in air that was never as good as it should have been. A man at the face did not experience Messines as a grand operation. He experienced it as the next section of earth in front of his boots or hands. The gallery did not care about the plan drawn above ground. It had to be cut in real clay, supported with real timber, cleared by real men. The same work repeated. Cut, gather, bag, move back, timber, ventilate, measure, listen. The operation may have been enormous, but its basic unit was still a man in a cramped passage doing one difficult thing correctly. As the galleries lengthened, the distance between the working face and ordinary daylight became more than physical. The men were not simply near the front. They were beneath a front that had been built to kill anyone trying to approach it. The deeper they went, the more they depended on the systems behind them. Ventilation pipes had to bring air forward. Pumps had to manage water. Tracks or carrying parties had to move spoil. Surveying had to keep the gallery pointed toward the correct target. Listening posts had to monitor the enemy. Mistakes could accumulate quietly. A wrong bearing might not reveal itself until much later. Poor ventilation might become deadly gradually. Water might seem manageable until it was not. A loose timber might hold under normal pressure and fail after a shell burst above. Underground engineering in war was never one problem. It was many problems packed into a space where men could not stand properly. And then there were the explosives. The charges under Messines were not small tactical charges laid in a hurry. They were vast mine charges, packed into chambers beneath German positions. In total, hundreds of tons of explosives were placed under the ridge. The substance most associated with these mines was ammonal, a high explosive mixture widely used in mining operations of the war. It had to be transported, stored, carried underground, placed and protected. It is one thing to say that a mine chamber was packed with explosives. It is another to imagine men bringing that material through narrow galleries, load after load, knowing what it would eventually do. A tunneler might spend months making a road through the earth, and then help fill the end of that road with enough force to tear open the surface above him. The labour was careful, not theatrical. Explosives had to be kept dry, handled correctly, and placed so that the blast would achieve the intended effect. The gallery behind the charge had to be tamped, packed to contain and direct the force. Even destruction required craftsmanship. The targets were chosen because the German defences on the ridge were strong and important. Places such as Hill 60, the Caterpillar, Spanbroek-Molen, Kruisstraat, Ontario Farm, Medelstede Farm, Petit Bois, Peckham, and other named positions became part of the underground plan. Some names sound almost harmless if you do not know what happened there. A farm name, a wood, a mill, a small rise in the ground. But in the language of the Western Front, these names became coordinates of danger. A peaceful-sounding place could contain trench systems, machine gun positions, dugouts, observation points, wire, and artillery targets. The tunnellers learned these names not as visitors learn a landscape, but as men working under it. They knew the ridge from below through measurements, sound, clay and strain. To them, Spanbroek-Molen was not only a point on a map. It was a direction in a gallery, a chamber, a charge, a long underground approach made by bodies in darkness. Today, one of the craters there is known as the Pool of Peace. The name is fitting now, but it can hide the work that made the pool possible. It was not made by peace. It was made by men preparing war under the earth. What I find remarkable about Messines is the contrast between the patience of the preparation and the violence of the result. The tunnels had to be protected for months. Some completed mines were held ready, maintained in silence, watched and guarded underground while the larger plane matured. That means men were not simply digging toward an immediate explosion. They were living with mines as hidden assets, waiting under the enemy line. Imagine the discipline required to keep such a secret. The infantry above might know something was happening, but not every man could know every detail. The Germans suspected mining in the area, and in some cases they interfered successfully with British work. They damaged or destroyed some chambers. Not every mine planned for Messina was fired on the day. Some failed, some were abandoned, some were lost, and some remained buried after the battle. That last fact is worth sitting with. The underground war could leave behind not only craters, but unexploded intentions. A plan laid in clay might outlast the men who made it. In the days before the attack, the ordinary surface war continued, but with a gathering purpose. Artillery preparation increased. Infantry units moved into assault positions. Supplies came forward. Stretcher bearers, engineers, signallers, artillerymen, medical units, and staff officers all entered the final machinery of the battle. But under the ridge, the mines waited. This waiting must have had a strange quality for the tunnellers. Their major labour was already done in many places. Charges had been laid, cables had been connected, chambers had been checked. The men knew, better than almost anyone, what lay beneath the German positions. They also knew that if the enemy discovered and destroyed a mine at the last moment, months of work could be lost. The final hours before a major underground detonation were not empty. They were full of inspections, tension, and the problem of trusting work that could no longer be fully seen. A man can look at a gun before it fires. He can inspect a rifle. He can watch artillery loading. A buried mine is different. Once it is sealed and connected, much of it exists as confidence in earlier labour. The attack was set for the early morning of June 7th, 1917. The hour was 3:10 a.m. That detail has become part of the memory of Messines because it is so exact. Before dawn, men waited in the dark. Infantry from British, Australian, New Zealand and Irish units were among those prepared to advance after the explosions. Some men later remembered the eerie quiet just before the mines went up. There are accounts of a nightingale singing shortly before the detonation, though it is the kind of detail that has passed into legend as much as history. Whether every part of that memory can be tested or not, the emotional truth is clear enough. There was a pause. Men knew something enormous was about to happen. The battlefield, usually full of noise, had a brief-held breath. Tunnellers, infantrymen, officers, gunners, stretcher-bearers, Germans in the line, everyone present occupied the same final seconds without sharing the same knowledge. Then the mines fired. 19 enormous charges detonated beneath the German positions within seconds of one another. The ridge erupted. The ground rose in columns of flame, earth, timber, trench material and bodies. The sound rolled across the battlefield with such force that it became one of the most remembered sounds of the war. Men miles away felt it. Accounts later claimed it was heard across the Channel. The blast was so immense that ordinary language struggles to keep it in proportion. But the important thing is not only the size of the explosion, it is what the explosion meant to the men directly above it. German soldiers in the mined positions had little or no chance. Some were killed instantly, some were buried, some were stunned, deafened, thrown, or left in broken trenches that no longer made sense as defences. Dugouts collapsed. Wire and parapets disappeared. Units were shattered before the infantry assault began. The mine was not a warning shot. It was the opening act of the attack. For the attacking infantry, the explosions were both terrifying and useful. They were useful because they damaged the German defences and disoriented the defenders. They were terrifying because no one could stand close to that kind of force and feel untouched by it. Men advancing after the mines had to cross ground that had just been ripped open. They moved toward a ridge under artillery cover, through smoke, dust, debris, and the psychological shock of the detonations. The mines had done what tunnelling mines were meant to do at their largest scale. They changed the immediate conditions of battle. They broke strong points, created confusion, and gave the assaulting troops a chance that they might not otherwise have had. The Battle of Messines is often remembered as one of the better prepared and more successful British attacks of the war. Compared with the disasters that haunt the memory of the Western Front, Messines stand out because preparation, artillery, mining, and infantry movement were coordinated effectively. But that success should not make the event feel clean. It was successful because immense violence was applied with unusual precision. General Herbert Plumer, commanding the British Second Army, is closely associated with the careful planning of the operation. Messines was not a wild gamble in the style of so many offensive hopes that dissolved into mud and casualties. The plan sought limited objectives. The ridge was to be taken, and the attack was prepared in detail. Artillery had specific tasks. Infantry had defined goals. The mines were integrated into the larger assault rather than treated as a spectacle. That is one reason Messines has a different reputation from other battles of the period. Yet for the tunnellers, the battle's reputation came after the fact. They didn't experience their work as a neat example of operational planning. They experienced it as months underground, the loss of men, the strain of keeping galleries alive, the fear of German countermining, the endless secrecy, and the knowledge that their work would end by killing men they would never see. There is a temptation to let Messines become only a story of scale. 19 mines, hundreds of tons of explosives, a huge detonation, a ridge taken. Those facts matter, but if we stay only with scale, we miss the human texture of the operation. The mines beneath Messines were built by men doing small jobs under unbearable conditions. A giant explosion begins with one man making a quiet cut in clay. It continues with another man filling a bag, another passing it back, another setting timber, another listening, another carrying pipe, another repairing a pump, another checking direction, another writing a report, another hauling explosives, another sealing the charge. The final blast compresses all of that labour into seconds, and then the spectacle can erase the workers who made it. That is why the tunnellers have to remain at the centre of the story. Without them, Messines is a battlefield event. With them, it becomes something else, a record of human endurance hidden beneath military success. The Germans on the ridge were not fools, and they were not passive. They had their own defences and their own underground knowledge. German countermining had damaged British work before the battle. At La Petite Douve farm, one mine was discovered and destroyed before it could be used. That loss shows how close the underground contest came to changing the plan. If more chambers had been found, the attack might have opened very differently. The British went to great lengths to keep the deeper mines concealed, and their success in doing so was one of the major achievements of the operation. But every success underground contained risk until the moment of firing. A mine chamber found by the enemy was not merely a lost weapon. It could become a burial place for the men sent to work near it. The underground front under Messines therefore remained active and dangerous right up to the battle. After the mines exploded, the craters became part of the surface battlefield. Some were enormous, deep wounds in the ridge. Men had to move around them, through them, and sometimes fight near them. The explosion did not remove difficulty. It changed its shape. Craters disrupted the German line, but they also created obstacles. The land itself had been rearranged. A mine that took months to prepare could make in seconds a feature that remained for more than a century. Several Messines craters still exist today, some filled with water, some quiet under trees and grass. Visitors may stand beside them and see stillness, birds, leaves, water, reflections. It is possible to look at such a place and feel peace before understanding what made it. That contrast is important. The land has a way of softening the surface of violence without erasing its origin. For the tunnellers who survived, the firing of the mines must have produced complicated feelings. There may have been relief that the work had succeeded. There may have been pride because skilled men know when a difficult job has been done well. There may have been exhaustion and grief for those lost in the preparation. There may also have been a silence that had nothing to do with satisfaction. The purpose of their work had been fulfilled, and that purpose was to kill and destroy. Good soldiers can believe in the necessity of a task and still feel the weight of what necessity required. The tunnellers had spent months protecting those charges from the enemy and from the earth itself. When the mines fired, they saw or felt the result of their own hidden labour in the open air. That is not an ordinary relationship to violence. An artilleryman fires from a gun position. An infantryman fires at a visible or suspected target. A tunneller builds death slowly under another man's feet and then waits for the ground to deliver it. The German survivors of the blast faced a battlefield that had changed around them before the attack truly arrived. Men in nearby positions were stunned by shock, dust, noise, and the sight of entire sections of line vanishing. Some defenders fought hard afterward. Many German units on the ridge were still capable of resistance away from the blast zones. It would be wrong to imagine that the mines alone won the battle. Infantry still had to advance. Artillery still had to suppress positions. Men still had to cross ground, take trenches, clear dugouts, and hold against counterattack. But the mines gave the attack an opening of rare force. They struck the ridge not as artillery strikes from outside, but from within the ground itself. That is what made them so psychologically devastating. The German defences had been built to face the British line. The mines came from beneath the defences, from a direction no parapet could face. By the end of the first day, the ridge had largely fallen to the attackers. Messines became, in military terms, a success. The village, already ruined, changed hands. The high ground that had allowed German observation over parts of the Ypres salient was taken. The attack showed what careful planning and limited objectives could accomplish, though it did not end the war or prevent later suffering in the region. The Third Battle of Ypres, remembered especially through Passchendaele, would follow in the months after, and the mud and casualties of that later campaign would darken any simple idea that Messines had solved the problem of the Western Front. Still, in June 1917, Messines demonstrated the most powerful use of mine warfare in the conflict. It was the peak of the tunnellers' offensive role, the moment when underground work changed the surface battle on a scale no one could ignore. And yet the peak was also close to the end of that kind of deep mining as a decisive method. The Western Front was changing. Tactics, artillery coordination, creeping barrages, aircraft, tanks, gas and other methods continued to develop. Mine warfare did not vanish immediately, but Messines represented a high point that would not be repeated in quite the same way by the British. Deep mining required time, stable lines, suitable ground, secrecy and huge labour. It belonged to a form of stalemate where armies sat close enough and long enough for underground approaches to be prepared. When the war became more mobile in 1918, the logic changed. You cannot spend months digging under a position if the position may move. In that sense, the mines beneath Messines were a product of the war at its most fixed. They were made by stalemate and designed to break one part of it. There is one more detail that stays with me. Not all of the mines laid for Messines exploded that morning. Some were not fired, some were later accounted for. One mine at Peckham detonated during a thunderstorm in 1955, decades after the battle, reminding people living in a changed world that the underground war had not entirely ended when the armies left. Another unfired mine is believed still to remain beneath the area, though its exact status is treated with caution because the old front is full of uncertainty. This afterlife of the mines matters because it shows how war can leave decisions underground. A charge placed for a battle in 1917 can become a danger for people not yet born when the battle was fought. The tunnellers' work was hidden not only from the enemy, but from time. Some of it waited long after the men who made it were gone. When visitors stand today near the Pool of Peace at Spanbroek Molen or near other Messines craters, the scene can feel almost gentle. Water fills the crater, trees grow, the sides are softened. The field does not shout its history. But beneath that calm is the memory of men lying in clay, driving galleries under an enemy ridge, keeping silence while artillery shook the world above them, and preparing charges large enough to alter the shape of the land. It is not necessary to exaggerate Messines. The facts are enough. A ridge held by one army, a plan made by another. Months of secret digging. 19 mines fired before dawn. Thousands of men killed, wounded, stunned, or thrown into a battle that began under their feet. A successful attack built on hidden labour and buried fear. The tunnellers who worked beneath Messines had done something that soldiers above ground could see only at the moment it became an explosion. For months their war had been invisible. Then, at 3:10 in the morning, it became the loudest thing on the field. That sudden transformation from silence to force is the central fact of Messines. It is also the central burden of the men who made it possible. They had lived with the underground war in its slow form, then watched it into history in its violent form. Afterward, the official accounts could list objectives taken and mines fired. Newspapers could describe the blast. Commanders could study the success. But the men who came up from the galleries carried something less tidy. They carried the memory of the dark before the explosion, the careful work, the buried friends, the sound of enemy digging, the weight of clay, and the knowledge that for one terrible morning the earth itself had been made into a weapon. The battle moved on, as battles always do. The infantry advanced, positions were consolidated, guns were shifted, wounded were carried back, and the front adjusted to its new shape. For the tunnellers, Messines did not erase the underground war that came before it. It gathered that war into one enormous result, and when the craters cooled and the smoke thinned, the men who had made the ridge erupt were still men who had spent too long below the ground. Some would continue tunnelling. Some would return to other duties. Some would survive the war and go back to mines, factories, towns, farms and families. But returning to the surface is not the same as leaving the underground behind, and what those men carried with them after Messines belongs to the next part of the story. After Messines, the tunnellers did not simply climb out of the earth and become ordinary soldiers again. That is the kind of clean ending history sometimes gives us because it is easier to arrange events that way. A great operation happens. The mines are fired, the ridge is taken, the craters fill with smoke and dust, and then the story moves forward to the next battle. But men do not move forward as neatly as armies do on maps. The tunnellers who survived Messines carried the underground war with them into whatever came next. Some returned to shafts and galleries elsewhere. Some were sent to build deep dugouts, subways, shelters, cable trenches, and underground chambers for troops who needed protection from heavier guns. Some were used as engineers in the ordinary hard ways. Armies use engineers, repairing roads, bridging gaps, destroying bridges, wiring defensive lines, digging positions, clearing obstacles, and later making captured ground safe from explosive devices left behind. Some, in the crises of 1918, were pushed into emergency infantry duties when the German offensives broke through, and every available man was needed to hold a line that suddenly began moving again. That matters because the tunnellers' war did not end when offensive mining reached its greatest display. The job changed shape, the men changed with it. A man who had spent months listening for enemy tools in clay might find himself above ground under artillery, building a shelter for other men, or fighting a withdrawal with a rifle in his hands. He had been trained by the underground to notice pressure, silence, small sounds, timber, air, and the behaviour of frightened men in confined spaces. Then the war asked him to use the same nerves in new places, and it did not ask whether he had anything left to give. The first change in these men was often visible in the body. Tunnelling was not a clean wound that could be pointed to easily. A man might not have a missing limb or a scar that made strangers fall quiet, but his back could be damaged by months of crouching, his knees ruined by cramped movement, his lungs affected by dust, fumes, damp air, and the general poison of the front, his hearing altered by explosions that came through earth instead of open air. His hands might remain thickened and cracked in the way working hands often do, but there was more inside the body than callus. There was fatigue stored in joints. There was the memory of bad air in the chest. There was the quick reaction to a creak overhead, the way a man might look up at a ceiling in a room that everyone else trusted. Many of these men had been miners before the war, and a miner was not a stranger to danger. That is important. We should not imagine that all of them entered the tunnels as innocent men unused to darkness. Some had already known roof falls, explosions, gas, dust, and the ordinary danger of earning a living underground. But the Western Front had added something civilian mining did not contain in the same way. It added an enemy. It added listening posts. It added the possibility that the other side was working deliberately to collapse the passage you were in. It added shell fire above and mines below. It added the knowledge that your skill was being used not to bring coal to the surface, or drive a sewer or build a railway, but to place destruction under another man's feet. So when a tunneller came back changed, it was not only because he had been underground. It was because the underground had been turned into a front line, and then, after months or years of that, he was expected to return to a world where floors stayed still and people closed doors without thinking. There is something quietly difficult about the return of men whose wounds were not always easy to show. A man with a bandage, a crutch, or a sleeve pinned empty carried evidence that others could understand at once, even if they could not truly understand what had happened to him. A tunneler might return looking much like himself. Older, thinner perhaps, more drawn around the eyes, but still whole enough for neighbours to say he was lucky. Lucky was a word used often after wars, and it could be a cruel word without meaning to be. He was lucky because he came home, lucky because he could work, lucky because he still had both hands, lucky because another family had received a telegram and his had not. All of that might be true. It did not mean he had come back unchanged. Some changes lived in habits. A man who had learned to listen through earth might become a man who noticed small domestic sounds too sharply. The settling of a house at night, pipes knocking in a wall, a cart passing in the street, a bootstep in the room above, a child dropping something in another room. Sounds that meant nothing to everyone else might arrive in him with a little flash of old meaning before reason corrected it. Not danger, just the house. Not a camouflage, just a door. Not enemy digging, just rain in the gutter. Imagine having to tell yourself that over and over, not in dramatic panic, but in small private adjustments that no one around you sees. This is how war often continues after it has supposedly ended. Not always as screams in the night, though those happen too, but as tiny misreadings of ordinary life. A sound comes in, and for a fraction of a second the body remembers the war before the mind remembers the room. Some tunnellers return to mining after the armistice, and that may be one of the most difficult possibilities to sit with. A man who had survived the galleries of France and Flanders could go back to a pit at home, because that was his trade, because families needed wages, because pride and necessity often walk together in mining communities. There is a hard practicality in that. The war did not remove rent. It did not remove hunger. It did not provide every survivor with a life gentle enough to heal him. A coalfield did not become safe because a man had already served underground in war. The cage still descended. The shift still began. The roof still had to be read. The air still had to be watched. The body still went down because work was work. But can you imagine that descent after the Western Front? The familiar pit might have been comforting to some men because it was known, because it belonged to wages and workmates rather than shells and German countermines. For others, the first lowering back into darkness must have carried a terrible echo. The lamp, the close roof, the smell of earth, the sound of tools, men speaking low. All the ordinary signals of the trade now tied to memories of listening posts, collapses, trapped comrades, and the feeling of a gallery going still because someone had heard something ahead. There is no single rule for what men felt. Some veterans spoke, some refused, some joked, some drank, some worked harder. Some became quiet in a way families learn to move around. History is full of men who survived and then made themselves difficult to read because the people around them needed them functional more than they needed them explained. The First World War was one of the first conflicts in which psychological trauma was formally recognised under the name shell shock, though that phrase did not fully explain what men had suffered and did not always protect them from judgment. The term itself came from an attempt to understand breakdown under bombardment, but many soldiers who had never been physically near a shell explosion showed symptoms of trauma, and many who had endured repeated blast and fear carried effects that doctors, officers, families, and pension boards struggled to classify. For tunnellers, the phrase shell shock only partly fits. Their trauma was not only the shell. It was the silence before the mine, the listening, the pressure, the collapse, the confined space, the air running thin, the sound of tapping beyond a fall, the knowledge that rescue might fail. A doctor might ask about trembling, nightmares, paralysis, speech problems, headaches, memory, panic, or exhaustion. How does a man explain that he cannot stand the sound of digging? How does he explain that a quiet room can become too quiet? How does he explain that lying in bed at night feels wrong because the dark above him is not open, but heavy? Some could not explain it because the language was not there yet. Others may not have wanted to try. Men of that generation were often trained by class, work, family, and military culture to keep their worst experiences contained. A miner in particular might come from a world where danger was not discussed too softly, because discussion did not change the need to go back underground. So the changed man might appear as a short temper, sleeplessness, a refusal to talk about the war, sudden anger at noise, long silences, or an inability to sit indoors too long. His family might know something was wrong and still not know what to call it. His children might learn that certain questions were not asked. His wife might understand that there were nights when he was not fully in the room, even if his body was sitting by the fire. His neighbours might say he had never been the same since France, and then go on with the day because there was coal to fetch, bread to buy, shifts to work, and very little space in ordinary life for men who had seen too much under the ground. The tunnellers also returned changed in their relationship to silence. Before the war, silence underground could be a useful thing, even a normal thing. Men in civilian mines listened for roof sounds, machinery, signals, and workmates, but the silence belonged to work. In France and Belgium, silence became a battlefield condition. It meant everyone must stop. It meant the enemy might be near. It meant the listener had heard something or was trying to hear something. After enough of that, silence is no longer empty. It becomes occupied. A man might come home to a quiet kitchen at night and find that quietness was not restful in the way others meant it. The household settling after dark, children asleep, the fire low, a clock ticking, these should have been signs of peace. For some men they may have been. For others, quiet may have opened a space into which old sounds returned. A faint scrape, a dull underground thump, the small final noises before the roof came down. The mind can be very loyal to danger. It remembers what once saved it, and continues offering the warning long after the warning is no longer needed. That is not weakness. It is the nervous system doing its old job in the wrong world. Work after the war could make things better or worse. Men who returned to manual labour had routines, mates, wages, and the dignity of usefulness. Those things matter. Idleness after war can be its own punishment. But hard work also left a little room for recovery. A man could be expected to take up his tools again as though the war were a separate chapter neatly closed. Mining communities knew death and injury already. They had funerals of their own without needing battlefields. A veteran tunneler might be absorbed back into that world with sympathy but also with expectation. He was a miner. Miners worked. That was the simple fact around which families survived. The old pit might not ask him what he dreamed. It asked whether he was on shift. And perhaps, for some, that blunt demand was helpful. It gave the day shape. It returned the body to known motions. It placed him among men who understood underground danger without needing long explanations. But there is a difference between being understood in part and being fully known. A workmate might understand roof fear and bad air. He might not understand the way another man's tapping behind a collapse still sounded at night years later. There were also men who did not return to mines at all, either because their bodies could not take it, because they found other work, because the war had broken their tolerance for confined places, or because economic conditions pushed them in different directions. The records do not give us every life. That absence should make us cautious, but not silent. We know enough about war, labour and trauma to understand that return was uneven. Some men managed. Some suffered quietly. Some families carried the burden without records ever naming it. Pension systems often demanded proof, and psychological injury was hard to prove in a culture suspicious of invisible wounds. A tunneler might have served in one of the most frightening jobs on the Western Front, and still struggle to convince officialdom that the war had followed him home. Paper likes clear categories. Human damage does not always respect them. One of the changes these men carried was the knowledge of how fragile ground could be. Most people treat the world beneath them as fixed. Tunnellers knew better. They had seen Earth become a weapon, shelter, obstacle, passage and grave. They had seen men live because a timber held and die because another failed. They had seen huge battle plans depend on damp clay cut quietly by tired hands. They had felt the surface of Europe as something layered and unstable. That knowledge does not leave easily. It may have affected how they walked through ordinary spaces, how they entered cellars, how they reacted to construction work, how they looked at a hillside, a quarry, a railway cutting, a pithead, or a newly dug trench for a town pipe. The ground had become readable to them in a way most people would never share. It held possibilities, some practical, some terrible. The war had taught them that hidden work could change the world above without warning. Family life after such work must have been complicated. A man might come home to children who had grown while he was away, to a wife who had managed years of worry and rationing and work without him, to parents aged by fear, to a community that wanted both stories and reassurance. People wanted to know what he had done, but not always in a way that allowed the truth. They might ask whether he had been in the trenches. He could say yes, and beneath them. They might ask whether it was bad. What could he answer? The real answer would take hours and still fail. It would require explaining how men lay in galleries listening for German picks, how a camouflage felt in the chest, how trapped men tapped through earth, how Messines waited in the clay for months, how an explosion could make a ridge rise before dawn, how a man could drink tea at a shaft mouth and then climb back into a place that might keep him. Instead, he might say it was rough, or not too bad, or nothing at all. Silence sometimes protects the listener as much as the speaker. A man may refuse to tell a story because he knows the person asking cannot carry it. There are also forms of pride. We should not describe these men only as damaged. They were skilled men who had done exceptionally difficult work. Many would have taken pride in belonging to tunnelling companies, in having used their trade under extreme conditions, in having contributed to battles like Messines, Vimy, Arras, the Somme, and countless smaller actions whose names did not become household words. Pride and trauma can live in the same person. A man can be proud of what he endured and still be harmed by it. He can respect his comrades and still wish he had never seen what happened to them. He can believe the work was necessary and still feel disturbed by the memory of what the mines did when they fired. The mistake is to force one feeling to cancel the other. Veterans rarely return with simple emotions arranged for our convenience. The tunneler might remember courage, jokes, competence, fear, resentment, boredom, grief, and satisfaction, all tangled together, because that is how real experience is stored. The end of the war in November 1918 did not end the practical tasks of engineers. Captured areas had to be made safe. Bridges, roads, railways, tunnels, mines, dugouts, and buildings had to be inspected. Explosive devices left behind by retreating armies had to be rendered harmless. The same men who had spent years creating underground danger might now be asked to remove danger from ground others needed to use again. There is a strange reversal in that. The tunneler as destroyer becomes the tunneler as cleaner of ruins. War turns trades toward destruction, and then, when the fighting stops, it turns the same trades toward repair. But repair of a road or a bridge is not the same as repair of a man. A village can be rebuilt stone by stone. A railway line can be relaid. A crater can fill with water and become a quiet pool. A man can go home, take off the uniform, return to work, sit at a table, and still carry an underground map inside him that no one else can see. Years later, the world around him might look peaceful. The children might grow. The street might be busy. The mine whistle might call men to shift. The church bell might ring. Markets might open. Football might be played. People might speak of the war less often because life, mercifully and sometimes cruelly, insists on continuing. but a smell of damp timber, a vibration through a floor, a muffled thud in the distance, or the close air of a cellar could bring back the gallery. Not always as a full memory, perhaps. Sometimes only as a bodily reaction. A tightened throat, a sudden need to step outside, a hand placed on a wall without thinking. A pause before entering a confined space. These are small things, easy for history to miss because no official form asks about them. Yet they are part of what it means to come back changed. The tunnellers' communities changed too. Mining villages and industrial towns had sent men whose civilian skills had become military necessities. Some returned, some did not. Some names went on memorials with infantrymen, artillerymen, sailors, and all the others. But the tunnellers occupy a particular place in memory, because their work was hidden even while it mattered. Families might know that a husband or son had been in the Royal Engineers, that he had worked underground, that he was at Messines or Givenchy or Vimy or La Boisselle, but the full nature of the work could remain vague. It was secret during the war and difficult to describe afterward. A man who fought above ground could point, at least in general, to trenches, attacks, shell fire. A tunneller had to explain a war under the war. Many probably did not try. That is how hidden labour becomes hidden memory. The work disappears once the men who did it stop speaking. The craters remain, but craters do not tell you about the man at the face, the listener in the post, the rescue party digging toward taps, or the survivor who later flinched at a sound in his own house. If we are careful, we can see these men not as legends, but as workers shaped by an extreme version of their own skills. They were not born for darkness. No one is. They learned it, or they had already learned part of it in civilian life, and then the war made that knowledge serve a front line that could not move. They came back with habits formed in places where a careless sound could kill, where the roof was never fully trusted, where silence had weight, where the enemy existed as vibration before he existed as a person. Some men may have folded those habits into ordinary life and lived long, useful years. Some may have suffered in ways no record preserves. Most likely many did both. They worked, raised families, kept memories, avoided memories, laughed when they could, slept when they could, and carried on because that was the expectation placed on men of their time. Carrying on should not be confused with being unhurt. Sometimes it is simply the form hurt takes when there is no other acceptable form available. When we think of men returning from the First World War, we often imagine the infantryman stepping off a train, the wounded man in blue hospital dress, the officer with a cane, the young veteran staring too long into the distance. Add another figure to that picture, a miner in uniform, older perhaps, with clay still somewhere in the memory of his hands. He has known a battlefield with no sky. He has learned to hear the enemy through earth. He has seen tunnels become graves and craters become objectives. He has helped make explosions that change the shape of ridges. Now he stands in a street at home, where people are walking over ordinary ground, trusting it completely. That trust may be the thing he finds most difficult to recover. Beneath every quiet road, beneath every floorboard, beneath every field that looks harmless in afternoon light, he knows there can be another world hidden from view. The war taught him that. It may have saved him. It may have damaged him. It certainly never left him in quite the condition it found him. And even after the men themselves grew old, even after their children became adults and the names of tunnelling companies faded from ordinary conversation, the ground on the Western Front kept some of their story. It kept the craters, the sealed galleries, the unexploded charges, the buried tools, the collapsed timber, and the men who never came home at all. To understand what still sleeps beneath the trenches, we have to leave the returned men at their doors for a while and go back to the land itself, because the earth did not forget simply because the war ended. The war ended above ground before it ended underneath. That is the simplest way to say it, and it is still not quite simple enough. At 11 o'clock in the morning on November 11th, 1918, the guns on the Western Front began to fall silent. Not everywhere at the exact same emotional moment. Not with every man suddenly understanding what peace would mean, but formally Officially, the fighting stopped. Men climbed out of trenches that had been home and prison. Units counted who was left. Horses stood among broken roads and abandoned gun positions. Rifles were stacked, orders changed, and the huge machine of war, which had seemed impossible to halt for 4 years, began the awkward work of stopping. But under the fields of France and Belgium, nothing stopped in the same way. Shells that had failed to explode remained in the soil. Grenades remained where they had been dropped or buried. Barbed wire rusted in layers. Dugouts collapsed slowly. Timber supports rotted. Tunnels filled with water or settled into the clay. Mine galleries held darkness. Some charges remained unfired. Some bodies remained where the battle had left them, because the battlefield had been too violent, too churned, too confused, or too dangerous for anyone to recover them. Peace came to the surface first. Beneath it, the war waited in metal, bone, timber, gas, chalk, and mud. This is why the former Western Front can never be understood only as a place where something happened long ago. It is a place where the past still has weight. It still comes up in fields. It still appears in construction sites. It still lies beneath roads, farms, woods, and quiet villages where people live ordinary lives over ground that is anything but ordinary. A farmer ploughing a field near Ypres or the Somme may turn up a shell more than a century after it was fired. A road crew may uncover human remains. A builder may find rusted ammunition. A child may be warned not to touch strange metal in the soil. Bomb disposal teams still answer calls because the earth keeps handing back the war in pieces. This annual recovery of shells, fragments, wire, and other military debris is sometimes called the Iron Harvest, and the name is almost too fitting. It sounds agricultural because it is tied to the seasons, to ploughing, rain, frost, and the repeated work of people who live on the land. But what is harvested is not grain. It is the residue of artillery, the failed machinery of death, the shells that did not detonate when they were supposed to, the grenades that waited, the ammunition that slipped from wartime control into the slow keeping of soil. In Belgium, specialist disposal teams still remove large quantities of unexploded ordnance every year. In northern France, remains of soldiers are still found during farming, building, excavation, and clearance work. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission is still informed of new discoveries of human remains each year across the world wars, and on the old Western Front the work of identification and burial continues. That fact should slow us down. It means the First World War is not only a date range. It is not only 1914 to 1918. It is an event whose physical consequences are still being managed by people born generations later. For the tunnellers, this afterlife of the battlefield feels especially fitting and especially cruel. Their war was hidden when it was active, and in many places it remains hidden now. We can visit the great craters at Messines, the Lochnagar crater near La Boisselle, the Pool of Peace at Spanbroek Molen, the preserved trenches and memorials and cemeteries where the landscape has been shaped for remembrance. Those places help us see. They give the buried war a visible edge. But most of the underground front is not visible. It is not marked by neat lines on the grass. The galleries that once carried men beneath enemy trenches are often collapsed, flooded, sealed, or lost. The timber has decayed. The maps are incomplete. Some entrances vanished under later shelling or post-war reconstruction. Some tunnels were never meant to be found again, and in those hidden places the work of the tunnellers remains not as a clear museum object, but as an absence underfoot. A space where men once breathed, listened, dragged spoil, passed explosives, and sometimes died without the sky above them. Think of what that means for a battlefield after 100 years. Above ground, people can rebuild. Bricks can be replaced. Roads can be resurfaced. Trees can grow where trees were shattered. Cemeteries can be tended with astonishing care. Stone names can be cleaned, replaced, and read aloud. But underground, the repair is different. The earth settles. It covers. It seals. It does not explain. A collapsed gallery does not tell a passerby whose hands made it or whose body remains beyond the fall. An unfired mine does not announce itself politely. An old shell under a field does not lose its danger simply because the men who fired it are gone. Time softens many things, but it does not safely disarm explosives. It does not identify every bone. It does not restore every missing man to a grave with his name on it. This is the reason former battlefields have a strange double life. On a clear day in Flanders, the fields can be beautiful. There are crops, cattle, church towers, roads, cyclists, school groups, visitors with guidebooks, families at cafes, birds moving across skies that once belonged to artillery smoke. The land looks peaceful because people have worked very hard to make life return there. That return matters. It is not disrespectful. It is necessary. People cannot live forever inside the visible wreckage of a war. Fields must be planted, children must go to school, houses must be repaired, roads must lead somewhere useful again. But beneath that ordinary life is another layer, and the people who live there know it better than most visitors. They know that a rusty object in a field may need a phone call. They know that metal from the war is not a souvenir to be handled casually. They know that remains, when found, must be treated not as objects, but as people returning late from a battlefield that misplaced them. There is a discipline in living with that inheritance, a quiet, practical respect that is different from ceremony, but just as real. The tunnellers left some of the most difficult inheritances because their work was designed to be concealed. At Messines, the mines that exploded on June 7th, 1917 left craters large enough to become part of the visible landscape. But not every mine laid for that battle was fired. Some were abandoned, lost, flooded, or left because they were no longer needed for the attack. One of the abandoned mines in the birdcage sector near Ploegsteert exploded during a thunderstorm in 1955, decades after the men who had prepared the Messines attack had become old or dead. Imagine that for a moment. The war had been over for 37 years. Europe had gone through another world war. Children had been born, grown, fought and returned or not returned from a second catastrophe. Then, under a Belgian field, a charge laid for the First World War answered weather instead of orders. Lightning or storm conditions helped to release a violence stored since 1917. That is not a ghost story. It is engineering and time, and somehow that makes it more unsettling. The mine did not remember the war. It remained physically capable of continuing it for an instant. Other unfired charges are believed still to remain in the Messines area, treated with caution and professional awareness rather than curiosity. That knowledge changes the meaning of a peaceful field. The absence of an explosion is not the same as the absence of danger. Some things sleep because they are dead. Some things sleep because they have not yet been disturbed. La Boisselle gives us another way to understand what still lies below. The area known to the British as the Glory Hole was one of the most intensely mined sectors of the Western Front. British, French, and German tunnellers fought beneath a small area that became a maze of galleries, explosions, collapses, and craters. Today, archaeological and historical work has helped recover parts of that underground story, showing how complex and close the mining war became there. But even careful excavation reveals only part of it. The underground battlefield is not a single room waiting to be opened. It is broken, flooded, collapsed, and layered. Each discovery raises more questions. A length of tunnel shows how men moved. A tool shows how they worked. A collapsed section shows where the earth or the enemy stopped them. A body, if found, changes the work entirely, because the battlefield becomes personal again in the most direct way possible. The missing man becomes not a number, not a name on a memorial alone, but someone physically present, someone who has waited in the ground longer than his own lifetime would have been. This continuing recovery of remains is one of the most solemn parts of the Western Front's afterlife. When soldiers are found today, specialists may study buttons, badges, boots, equipment, identity discs if they survive, dental evidence, location, unit records, and sometimes DNA, to try to restore a name. Often, identification is impossible. The violence of the war, the passage of time, soil conditions, lost records, and the scattered nature of remains can defeat even careful work. When a soldier cannot be identified, he may still be buried with military honours under a headstone that names him as a soldier of the great war known unto God. That phrase can sound familiar enough to pass over, but it carries a heavy compromise. It says that the person is not unknown in a spiritual sense, not without dignity, not abandoned, but it also admits that human records have failed. Somewhere a man had a name used by his mother, his friends, his workmates, perhaps his wife or children. Somewhere that name was spoken casually over breakfast, shouted in a street, written on an envelope, entered on a paysheet. The war took him into a field, and the field kept him beyond recognition. When he is found a century later, the ceremony restores honour, but not always identity. That is one of the unfinished tasks of the war, and it may never be completed. The memorials to the missing exist because of that incompleteness. At the Menin Gate in Ypres, at Thiepval on the Somme, at Ploegsteert, at Arras, at Tyncot, and in other places across the old front, names stand in stone where bodies could not be placed under named graves. The lists are not static. Sometimes names are adjusted. Sometimes remains are discovered and identified, and a name can be removed from a memorial to the missing because the man now has a known grave. Think about how extraordinary that is. A name carved as missing after the war can, generations later, be reunited with remains found by a farmer, a builder, or an archaeological team. The dead do not change, but our knowledge of them does. The Western Front still corrects its own record one discovery at a time, and yet for every identification, many more remain uncertain. The missing are not all waiting to be found in a way that stories can satisfy. Some will remain missing because the battle destroyed the evidence too completely. This is another thing the land holds. Not only bodies, but the limits of what can be known. For tunnellers specifically, the missing can be especially hard to place. A man killed in a tunnel collapse may have no recoverable battlefield position in the ordinary sense. His unit might know the shaft, the gallery, the incident, the approximate location, but if the tunnel was sealed, destroyed, or lost, the body could remain beyond practical reach. Some tunnellers killed underground were recovered and buried. Others were not. Their graves may be the galleries themselves. That is difficult for modern remembrance because we like to gather the dead into places where care can be shown. Cemeteries are acts of order after chaos. Rows of headstones, clipped grass, flowers, registers, walls and paths all say that human attention has returned to what war tried to scatter. A sealed tunnel does not offer that same comfort. It remains a grave without a path to the headstone. The man is held by the place where he worked, and the place may be known only in records, if at all. There is a hard honesty in accepting that. Not every loss can be made visible. Not every grave can be visited. Some remembrance has to be carried without a precise location. The old tunnels also sleep as evidence of labour. That may seem small beside unexploded shells and human remains, but it matters. A tunnel is work made into space. Every foot was cut by someone. Every support was carried and set. Every bag of spoil was filled and moved. Every measurement reflected an intention. When archaeologists or historians study surviving tunnels and dugouts, they are not just studying military architecture. They're studying the movements of men. A low roof tells us how bodies bent. A narrow passage tells us what kind of movement was possible. Tool marks tell us about method. A niche for a candle or lamp tells us where light was placed. A listening post tells us where a man sat still and tried to hear the enemy. These details bring history out of the abstract. They remind us that the underground war was not a diagram. It was a workplace built in fear. And because many of those workplaces still exist only as buried traces, the story remains partly hidden by its very nature. The surface of the Western Front has become one of the most visited historical landscapes in the world but the underground front resists visitors. You can stand above it. You can read about it. In some preserved or studied places you may see sections of tunnels, dugouts or entrances, but most of it cannot be walked. That inaccessibility may be appropriate. The tunneler's world was never meant to be open. It was secret, cramped, dangerous, and temporary. To remember it properly, we do not need to turn every gallery into a display. We need to understand what kind of human experience took place there, and why so little of it could ever be visible. The men who worked underground accepted a kind of disappearance even while alive. They vanished down shafts to do work that would only be noticed if it succeeded or failed dramatically. If a mine fired, the explosion became famous. If a gallery collapsed, the dead might be recorded. But the ordinary shifts, the listening, the clay on hands, the stale air, the jokes, the fear managed hour by hour, those things mostly sank back into the earth with them. What still sleeps beneath the trenches is therefore not only dangerous material, it is also uncounted experience. The Western Front still contains stories that no one wrote down because the men involved were too tired, too secretive, too modest, or too dead to tell them. A rusted shovel may not carry a name. A collapsed timber may not tell us who placed it. A tunnel map may not record the man who panicked and was steadied by a friend, or the man who gave away his place in a rescue opening, or the listener who saved a trench by hearing something no one else could hear. History works with what survives, but the underground war reminds us how much survival depends on chance. Paper burns, timber rots, bodies are scattered, explosives remain, names are lost, and still the ground keeps enough to trouble us. There is a reason visitors to the old battlefields often speak in lowered voices even when they are standing in open air. Part of it is respect, of course, Part of it is the scale of the cemeteries, the endless headstones, the names, the age of the dead. But part of it may also be the feeling that the land has depth. Not scenic depth, but historical depth. You're never only standing where something happened. You may be standing over something that remains, a shell, a dugout, a tunnel, a fragment of rail, a boot, a man. The ordinary habit of trusting ground becomes complicated there. That complication is one of the tunneler's legacies. They taught us, unwillingly, that a battlefield is not only horizontal, it has levels. The war existed in the sky through aircraft and artillery observation. It existed on the surface through trenches and attacks. It existed below through dugouts, mines, and listening galleries. When we remember only one level, we misunderstand the whole place. The question of what still sleeps beneath the trenches also belongs to the future. Unexploded ordnance will not all be cleared in our lifetimes. More remains will be found, some will be identified, many will not. Archaeology will continue to recover details from sites where access is possible. Farmers and builders will continue to be the accidental discoverers of history. Memorials will continue to need care. Records will continue to be corrected. Families may still receive news that a relative missing for more than a century has been found or identified. That news must be strange beyond measure. It reaches into a family story that may have become distant, almost inherited rather than personally felt, and suddenly gives it weight again. A great-uncle, a grandfather's brother, a name on a village memorial, a photograph in uniform, a man whose grief belonged first to people long dead, becomes present again because the earth returned him. In that sense, the Western Front is still producing funerals. Late funerals, careful funerals, funerals with flags, prayers, military representatives, archaeologists, officials, and sometimes relatives who know the man only through generations of family memory. The time between death and burial can be more than 100 years. There is something humbling in that. It shows that duty to the dead can outlive the people who first owed it. It can pass into institutions, communities, and strangers. The tunnellers would have understood practical duty. Their work depended on doing what was necessary even when no one watched. Perhaps there is a connection there. The men who are found now are cared for by people who never knew them, because care is still necessary. The task remains even when the original witnesses are gone. When we return in thought to the tunneler himself, the man at the face, the listener, the rescuer, the miner who came home changed or did not come home at all, the modern battlefield becomes less distant. He is not only part of a vanished army, he is part of the reason the land still cannot be treated as empty. His work altered the ground. His danger remains in the stories of collapsed galleries and unfired mines. His dead comrades remain in the missing and the recovered. His fear remains in the idea that the earth beneath a quiet field may still contain what war put there. And his skill remains in the tunnels that can still be traced, mapped, excavated and understood by those willing to look below the surface. Tonight, after all of this, the most ordinary thing may feel different. A floor under your feet, a room with safe walls, a lamp you can switch off without worrying about air, timber, or the sound of another man digging nearby. The tunnellers lived in a world where none of that safety could be assumed. They went beneath enemy trenches because the war above had made forward movement almost impossible. They listened through earth because the enemy was doing the same. They dug toward death because that was the task given to their trade. Some came back and carried the underground inside them. Some remained below, where the battlefield closed around their last shift. And the land, patient in a way people are not, kept what it was given. It kept the shells that failed, the mines that waited, the tunnels that collapsed, the tools that rusted, the names that could not be matched to bodies, and the bodies that may one day return to names. That is what still sleeps beneath the trenches. Not a legend, not a mood, not a distant symbol, but the physical remainder of decisions made by armies and carried out by ordinary men in extraordinary darkness. The war is over. The fields are green. The roads are open. The cemeteries are tended. But under the surface, in places where clay and chalk remember pressure better than people remember dates, the hidden front has not entirely disappeared. It waits quietly, and every so often when a plough turns, when a spade cuts, when rain shifts the soil, or when careful hands begin another recovery, the earth gives back one more piece of the war beneath the war.